Hey folks, Ace here. This video is a tier list of all of the base classes in Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. If you didn't know, Pillars of Deadfire is definitely one of my favorite CRPGs and just one of my favorite games of all time. And because I like it so much, I like to make content on it from time to time. I'm focusing on it more now though because the next game in the IP, Avowed, is due to release sometime this year and I am hyped. Now, there's going to be people in the comments telling you that I shouldn't be hyped and you shouldn't be hyped because they think the trailers don't look good. I'm just going to put it out here now. I completely disagree. I think the trailers look great and I am optimistic for the game. I want it to do well, so I'm covering this series leading up to its release. However, even if Avow is terrible, the Pillars of Eternity series are still going to be some of the greatest games of all time, and I want more people to play them. So that's my motivation for covering a game which is not exactly new these days. This video has two parts. The first is the tier list proper, where I rank all of these classes and tell you my thoughts on them. I actually recorded that part weeks ago. I then sent that to one of the top 5 experts in Pillars of Eternity Deadfire, Thelee, and the second part of the video is a discussion that him and I had on the finer details of the rankings. Please check out that part. I think the discussion was awesome, and I've been a fan of Thelee's for most of a decade, so it was super cool to get to pick his brain on this subject. Before diving in, let's discuss the underlying assumptions of these rankings. This list is for Real Time with Pause, Full Party, Paths of the Damned plus Trial of Iron difficulty, and that's the core. So it's not factoring in solo play, it's not factoring in any of Magran's fires, and thus by extension, it's not factoring in ultimate runs. So don't go linking ultimate runs to argue with me in the description. I do not consider those relevant to these rankings. The ultimate is very cool. It is the peak achievement in the CRPG landscape. But the ultimate is not the base game. They are so different because of the extra rules that are applied to the ultimate run that they're really just not relevant to each other. Also, as usual, I'm not factoring in game-breaking bugs like Strand of Favor plus Blade Cascade, anything in that realm of cheesiness, which is also a bug I am factoring out. Now, there are some things which I consider cheesy, which are definitely not bugs, that I'm including in this video, which is a little different than how I do it in Baldur's Gate 3, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. Moving on now, I just want to get it on the record that I consider this a low-resolution tier list. Low resolution in that it only ranks the 11 base classes, which is not the level of detail I would like in a comprehensive class tier list, right? Because a true high-resolution tier list would not just rank the 11 single classes, but every multi-class combo in the game. And that would be, I believe, 66 unique classes total, which is a lot. Now, I hope to do that video or that series of videos someday where I rank every single one of the 66 available classes in this game on a tier list, but it's just not feasible for now. So for now, I'm just going to rank these 11 base classes. However, I will be factoring in both their single class and what they offer in a multi-class as well. Finally, let's discuss the tiers. Longtime viewers of my channel will notice I've replaced my typical 5-tier system with this custom-made 4-tier system. Hopefully the names of the tiers are self-explanatory, but in case they're not, game-breaking tier is for classes which offer legitimately game-breaking strategies that are so powerful they require special ranking. I consider something game-breaking when it's so good you no longer have to interact with the tactics of the game. So, of course, these are the things I was talking about earlier when I said I banned them from my runs, but I'm including them in this video. The next tier is Overloaded tier. This is for classes which just offer so much that they stand ahead above their competitors. Typically, these classes are the linchpins of what I consider some of the strongest builds or composition strategies in the game. Bread and Butter tier is for classes which are solid. They offer enough that they are attractive as a class, and so you're likely to include, 1 to 3 of these at some level in your composition, but they're definitely not the linchpin of the best strategies the way overloaded classes are. And then finally we get to Niche tier. This is for classes which tend to be underpowered except in a few niche builds or strategies. We'll discuss those more as we get into those classes. Now, I also want to say, that this is a very well-balanced game. That's one of the reasons why it's so good. I found this ranking very difficult to make, and I had to consult many people who have many more hours in the game than I do. And we don't all agree. So you can definitely make top-tier builds with any of these classes in the game. If there's a class you really like that's a niche tier, and you think I'm underrating it, you could be right, because this is not an easy thing. Ultimately, what I'm offering you here is just my perspective. I think it's an informed perspective, and at the very least, if I'm wrong, you will still learn something. So, all right, enough of the disclaimers. Let's actually dive into the ranking. I guess we're just going to do this in alphabetical order, starting with Barbarian. Barbarian is going to go into niche tier. Let's look at the class. So here is the Barbarian leveling tree. Basically, the niche for Barbarians is that they are fairly durable weapon strikers that are focused on lifesteal tanking and dealing lots of AoE damage to mobs. That's their niche as far as I see it. The signature ability of Barbarians and Pillars of Eternity is Carnage. This basically turns your weapon attacks into area of effect attacks. It applies a 33% of your base weapon damage in an area. And I do believe you roll attack rolls to make sure that this damage hits. But yeah, that's the basics of Carnage. I must say that Carnage is significantly nerfed compared to how it worked in Pillars of Eternity 1. In Pillars of Eternity 1, Carnage was so cool. I haven't got into the math of it, but it just felt like it did more damage. But the most important thing is that you could apply on-hit effects from your weapons in the Carnage attacks as well. So, for example, if you equipped your Barbarian with, say, Tall Grass Pike or St. Rumbolt's Hours, these are weapons which would apply the prone condition on a crit. And then you could stack intelligence, like max out intelligence on your Barbarian. So now your Carnage AoE is huge. And also the duration of the prone on your crit is huge. And then you would crit on every swing. You're likely to crit at least a few people in that Carnage radius, right? So you were not only dealing tons of AoE damage, you were just proning targets. And it was super, super cool. All of that has been nerfed in Deadfire. Carnage is no longer the thing to build around. And just as a little rant, I find it kind of frustrating because I do not believe that Carnage was overpowered in the original Pillars of Eternity. My perception is that they nerfed Carnage not because it was overpowered, but because a lot of people complained that they felt it was dumb that you would ever want to build intelligence and perception on your Barbarian, which is really frustrating to me because it's not like the classic Constitution strength Barbarian was bad in Pillars of Eternity. It is still probably the optimal way to build Barbarian. It's just you had this cool alternative route where you had like a wizard intellect Barbarian that was knocking everyone prone with their super cool attacks, and that had to be nerfed because a lot of people complained about it. At least that's my very anecdotal perception. So anyways, back to the Barbarian in Pillars of Eternity Deadfire. The other major thing that Barbarians do is, of course, Rage or Frenzy. It adds plus 25 to your action speed. It gives you the Strong and Fit inspiration at the price of minus 10 to Deflection. A very good trade-off. This is a solid DPS buff, especially in the early game. And it develops in two interesting routes. The first one is the kind of Blood Frenzy route. This will deal raw bleeding damage on targets when you crit them. And when you kill targets, it will increase the duration of the frenzy, which is neat. However, the much stronger route, in my opinion, is the Spirit Frenzy route. This one will basically apply CC debuffs in an aura around you while you are raging. And the most important one of them is the one you get at tier 7, which causes the Terrify Affliction. The Terrify Affliction is very, very important in this game. We're going to be talking about it a lot. When a target is terrified, they will do nothing on their turn except for do a quick burst where they run in a random direction. So this does two things. First, it's a classic piece of crowd control in that whenever targets are terrified, they are not attacking you, they're not casting spells, they are wasting their time. So it's already really good for that reason. However, on top of that, they might run away from you, which has the potential to proc attacks of opportunity, or as they're called in this game, disengagement attacks. Now, proccing disengagement attacks is a really, really good strategy to build around because it's a straight up injection into your action economy. Those attacks trigger without taking from what you're normally spending your time doing. In fact, they don't even have an attack animation. It just triggers the attack in an instant. And that's really, really strong just from an action economy perspective. If you have a guy that's building to make lots of attacks and deal lots of damage on those attacks, getting terrified on targets that he's engaged with is just going to give him a half dozen free attacks in any particular encounter, maybe even more, depending on how long the fight goes and how many targets there are. However, it's an even better strategy in Pillars of Eternity than it is in most games because disengagement attacks are significantly boosted in this game. It's hard to find the exact numbers, but because I believe the wiki misreports it. My understanding is that an unboosted disengagement attack, just a standard disengagement attack that any character can get, will be a normal attack plus 20 to your accuracy and plus 100% to your damage. So effectively double damage. That's really, really strong. That, by comparison, that's much better than a crit. Much better than what you get from a crit. But the plus 20 accuracy is actually going to make it more likely that you crit. So it even stacks with crit bonuses. It's just really, really good. I am telling you, disengagement attacks in this game slap. And then you can actually build to make them even more powerful. So they're action economy breaking, they're extremely boosted, and it just makes it really, really strong as a strategy. So any source of Terrify, like for example, this Spirit Tornado Rage, you're always going to look closely at that. And Barbarians have one of a handful of ways that you can get it. And what's really cool is you're getting it on the character that wants it, because Barbarians are already going to want to be fighting in the middle of mobs and building a lot of engagement and, forcing those targets to disengage. So that's one major thing. And this terminates at 7, so you can get this on a multi-class. That is something to keep in mind. Now, besides Frenzy, most of the other actives that Barbarians get are pretty bad. They are mostly a passive-oriented class. So we'll look at some passives in a second. The only other active that's worth mentioning is the Yell line, or Roar line, you might call it. I like to call that Yop. I think they missed an opportunity there. It should be Barbaric Yop because of Walt Whitman, But yeah, this line is actually very, very pivotal if you go single class Barbarian, because of its interactions with your passives. We'll talk about that in a bit. So if I can just highlight a few of the really key passives that Barbarians get, we'll start with the big one here, which is definitely Bloodthirst. With the Bloodthirst passive, whenever you kill a target, it will immediately refund the recovery of your action. So how this works in game is, if you make an attack, at the termination of that attack, if it kills a target, it will immediately start the animation for your next attack or action that you have queued up. What's really cool about this is it's kind of a way to get a high attack speed and a lot of actions in combat without actually building dexterity and action speed in your kit. It completely bypasses all of that, right? Technically, if you dump dexterity, you're getting more value out of this because the recovery that you're refunding is higher, right? So that's another niche I forgot to mention, is that Barbarians kind of have this weird action speed bypassing niche for their builds that really no other class offers. So Bloodthirst is very big, and that's coming in at tier 7, so again, that will work for multi-classing. There's a lesser version of it you could get in the early game, Bloodlust. Well, that will give you a 20% action speed on a kill. That definitely adds up in the early game. And then finally, there is Barbaric Retaliation. You can only get this on a full class Barbarian, and this is a very interesting ability. With this, whenever a target crits you, you get to make a full attack back at them, which is weird until you start combining this with lifesteal effects, any kind of effect in the game which will heal you by a percentage of the damage you deal, and there's a few of them. We're going to talk about them in a bit. In fact, the Barbarian gets one, which we'll see in a second. And this creates the kind of major loop for the full class Barbarian, where you actually want to just wear the heaviest armor you can. You want to kind of dump dexterity and invest everything into dealing damage with your attacks, but attacking slowly, and just count on Barbaric Retaliation and Bloodthirst to get your attacks in. And of course, all of the bonus attacks, disengagement attacks you'll get from your Terrify Affliction, right? And if you're dealing enough damage with all of those, I mean, you can imagine it creates like a little loop where a target crits you and you attack back at them and kill them, which is going to attack proc Bloodthirst, which allows you to attack again, and then a target runs away from you from Frenzy, which gives you another attack, and then maybe the Carnage from that attack kills another target, which does Bloodthirst, which allows you to kill the target that just disengaged from you, and you stack up enough sources of this damage, and there's enough targets in the area, you just deal enough damage that you're reliably killing targets, proccing Bloodthirst, and counting that as your action economy, not the standard dexterity. And that is when the yells come in, because at the final tier of yell, you actually get damage on it, and it's damage that scales deceptively well, because technically this is a PL1 ability. So you're getting 8 PLs by the time you reach max level to scale this with. So the damage scales up quite a bit. It also has 1 rage cost even at max level that you're casting it with, so you can really, really spam this. So now you're spamming it for tons of AoE damage, which makes you more likely to pluck Bloodthirst, which makes you more likely to do more Driving Roar, and then you've got Terrify, and you've got Retaliation. And if you're life-stealing through all of that damage, you can actually just tank all of the hits from Retaliation and out-heal them with your lifesteal effect. So that's kind of the core loop for Barbarian, and that's the core niche that I see Barbarian in. Now let's look at subclasses. There's 4 subclasses. Most classes have 4. I'm probably only going to be able to talk about 2 subclasses per class for the sake of time. For the Barbarian, this is a very simple choice because they kind of have 2 meme classes, which are Corpse Eater and Mage Slayer. What these offer aren't really good enough to compete with the other options. So they can be cool for role-playing perspectives. I especially like Corpse Eater. I love being able to play like a Hannibal Lecter-style cannibal in my games. More games should allow me to do this. Mechanically speaking, yeah, your choices are really between Berserker and Fury Shaper. So we'll look at Berserker first. Here's what you get from it. Basically, it buffs your Frenzy from the very beginning of the game, where instead of getting the Strong and Fit Inspiration, you will gain the upgraded Tenacious Inspiration and Hardy Inspiration. Now, Tenacious is going to give you, on top of your +5 Strength, it'll give you +2 to your Penetration. Hardy is going to give you +2 to your Armor. So you're effectively getting +2 Penetration, +2 Armor, and that's very, very strong, especially in the early game. It comes with a drawback, though, that you cannot see your health while you're frenzied. That's pretty meh. If you have enough healing, it won't really matter. You'll take continuous raw damage. Again, very easy to offset this if you have enough healing. The big penalty is that you are confused while you're frenzied. Now, what confused does is it lowers your intellect. That's a big bummer because you want that intellect to broaden the AoE of all of your AoE abilities and the duration of your frenzy. But most importantly, it makes it so all of your AoE attacks become both friend or foe targeting. So your Carnage, for example, or your Yell at late game will not only hit your enemies, they will hit your allies and even hit yourself. And that is a very, very severe drawback. So what you want to do for this class is just build around it to get the awesome penetration and armor bonuses and offset this confused. There's a few ways to do it. One is with a seafood dish that you can start making pretty much in the mid game, which will make you immune to intellect afflictions, and confused is one of those things. The other way is to equip Modware, which is a soulbound sword, which will give you immunity to intellect afflictions as well. Both are good options. However, the more interesting subclass for me is the Fury Shaper. This is the one you pretty much want to go all of the time. The Fury Shaper adds certain summons. They're like totems that you place on the map that are going to give AoE boosts in the radius of the totem. So there are 3 altogether. The first is the Frenzy Ward. So when you place this ward, everyone in the area of effect will get their action speed boosted. I believe it's by 25%, maybe it's 20%. Either way, incredible. When you realize that's applying to every member of your party in the AoE, it really, really adds up for damage. It's a big injection to your action speed. And you're getting that right at the early game. Very, very strong. At tier 4, you get Fear Ward, and this will terrify enemies in a pulse out. Again, really good for all the reasons we already talked about with Terrify. I actually consider this a stronger version of Terrify than the one you get from Spirit Tornado, and you get it earlier in the game. So when you go Fury Shaper, you can actually go the Blood Frenzy route, and then get the Ward for Terrify really strong. And then finally, if you're a single class Fury Shaper, you can get Blood Ward. This will grant a lifesteal effect to all allies and yourself in the area of effect. I believe it's a 15% conversion, so 15% of the damage you deal will be converted to health, which is pretty nice. That's to all members of your party, and this stacks with other sources, which we're going to be talking about in a bit. Again, really putting the Barbarian in this niche of life-stealing compositions. So if we return to our tier list now, yeah, this is the niche for Barbarian. They are a tanky frontline damage dealer that's focused on clearing mobs, bypassing action speed, and just lifesteal tanking. The reason I put them in niche is that they are the kind of brawler archetype, melee martial weapon strikers on the front line that are both durable and high damage. And in that archetype, they compete with two other classes in this game, namely Fighter and Monk. And as we'll see when we get to them, both Fighter and Monk are very strong classes. And of the three of them, Barbarian ends up kind of being like the annoying kid brother just tagging along. If you're trying to pick that brawler archetype, you're going to want to go Fighter or Monk, not Barbarian. So that's why it's a niche tier. Moving on now to Chanter, one of my favorite classes in all RPGs everywhere. Chanter is going into Overloaded tier. I'm excited to talk about this class. Okay, so Chanter is Pillars of Eternity's version of the Bard, and it is a much better design and cooler version than any Bard I've ever seen in any other game. It's like a bard in that they do spells through poetry and history and stories and stuff like that. How it's different is that there's a natural rhythm to the class, and you get to create your own poems that you're chanting in combat. It's so cool. The big reason to pick a chanter in Deadfire, in my opinion, is for the chants, because it's easy to overlook how good chants are. You've heard me already talk a lot about action economy breaking or action economy income. And having a chant is just a whole other dimension. It's like a whole nother vector of action economy you can tack onto your unit. You can be like the Barbarian, where you completely dump your action economy to make yourself tanking, and that won't affect how fast you chant. Your chants are always going to be going independent of that. Alternatively, you could say dual class a chanter with a wizard and spend all of your actual actions casting wizard spells, and you'd still be benefiting from the chanter class because while all that's happening, your chants are still going. So it's a whole other vector. When I first started playing this game, I asked the question, I think it's a legitimate question to ask, why shouldn't every member of your party be a multi-class chanter? Because if you don't have a chanter tacked onto your unit, you're missing out on a whole new vector of action economy. And that is very potent. It's an interesting question to ask. So if we just highlight some of the powerful chants in this game, there are many really good ones. A lot of them are healing oriented, like the ones we talked about. Soft Winds of Death will heal allies in the area. Ancient Memory will heal allies in the area. There's also some really good offensive buffs, like for example for ranged attackers. Sure-Handed Illa will reduce recovery time and reload time, which is actually very, very good. One of my favorites, Mythfire. Mythfire will chant a plus 15% burn lash on all weapon attacks for your allies in the radius. It's actually more than plus 15% likely because it will scale with your power level. So by late game, it'll go even higher, usually into the 20s, I believe, depending on how you make your build. If you have a team composition that deals a lot of weapon damage, this becomes a very, very potent buff. Even if you go full tank on your chanter, the damage they deal just by buffing other targets' weapons can be quite high. And then there's probably my favorite chant in the entire game, Old Sake. Old Sake is another lifesteal effect, just like the Blood Ward that we talked about with the Barbarian. In the radius for as long as this chant is going, You and all allies will get a 12% damage dealt return as healing. You can think of this as like a healing lash. Just like there's a fire lash, this is a healing lash, except it applies to all sources of damage, not just weapon damage. It actually works even better with spellcasters, is my experience, because spells in this game tend to do more damage than weapons. So you can build glass cannon with your spellcasters and still get a lot of durability just from the healing effects from like this or Blood Ward and other sources in the game as well. It's very, very strong. You can also combine that with Mercy and Kindness, which buffs healing even more. That'll buff the healing from Old Sake, and Ancient Memory, and any of your Cleric healing or your Druid healing. Just all around a really good buff in any healing-oriented composition, which can be good. Passive healing in particular is very strong in this game because healing can go on infinitely in theory. It's kind of one of these bottlenecks where if you always out-heal their damage, you just never die. There's no other way to kill you unless they drop your health to 0. So, and then finally, maybe one of the strongest chants in the game is Many Lives Pass By. This is a summoning chant. Each time you finish a phrase of this chant, it will summon a skeleton who fights for you. And these skeletons do not count towards your summoning total, so you could theoretically summon like an infinite amount of them, is my understanding. There are ways to chant this so quickly that you summon more skeletons than enemies can kill them, and it becomes like a tanking strategy. They don't deal very much damage, but they absorb aggro, especially for boss fights. If you have a boss that attacks you, single target attack, and let's say it deals 1,000 damage on hit. That's going to kill the tankiest tank in your party in one hit. But it's also going to kill a skeleton in one hit. So in that situation, a skeleton is just as good at a tank as your main tank that you spent all this time building, only you're getting it every 3 seconds as a chant. So really powerful summoning thing here. And just in general, that's the other niche, if we go to invocations now for chanters, is chanters are the best summoners. Their best invocations, in my opinion, are their summoning invocations. There's a few standouts here. You can just straight up summon a dragon. The dragon does all right damage, but it's mostly just a massive sack of meat that's very difficult for enemies to get through. The same with ogre summons are the same deal. You get 2 ogres. They have a lot of hit points, and they can just tank for you if the skeletons aren't doing it. If you want damage, though, one of the highest damage summons in the game is Ancient Instruments of Death. This summons 3 animated weapons that actually deal a fair amount of damage, especially if you can get penetration on them. You can also buff them with Mythfire for even more damage. And it goes without saying that every summon that you put on the field is another target that can benefit from your passive buffs, right? So that's the major niche and loop of this class. But it also has some pretty good crowd control abilities. Like, for example, at the sound of his voice, this will paralyze targets for a little bit. The shield cracks, very, very important offensive invocation. This will lower armor rating by 2, but as the target takes damage, it will increase the duration. So in boss fights, it's basically a permanent -2 for the entire fight as long as you cast it once. You can think of a -2 armor rating on a boss fight as being like a +2 to the penetration of your entire party, which is really, really strong. I hear a lot of people complain about how their characters deal no damage, and almost always the reason why you're dealing no damage is because you're ignoring armor rating and penetration. You cannot ignore it, and the shield cracks is a very, very valuable and convenient source of negating armor rating. Anyways, there's a ton of angles I can talk about with this class, but we really do have to move on. If we return to our list now, Chanter's just an overloaded tier because of how much it offers, especially in the healing and summoning angle of things. You almost always want at least one Chanter somewhere in your party. Chanters work both as a multi-class and as a single class. It doesn't super matter. I usually multi-class my Chanters, but it's up to you. Next up on our list is Cipher. Cipher is the first class going into game-breaking tier. Alright, so I've already talked a little bit about Cipher if you watched my beginning intro video. So I'm going to be a little brief because I've talked about this before and you can go back to a previous video to see. But yes, Ciphers really do belong in game-breaking tier. I kind of think they're the best class in the game, although it's hard to see that in your first playthrough of the game. What makes them so powerful is kind of subtle, very easy to miss. the really game-breaking thing about Ciphers is that they are an infinite resource hack. Let's take a look at it. Ciphers are a natural Gish class. They have all of these spells over here, and to cast them, it's going to take a resource called Focus. Focus is generated through your Soul Whip ability, where it will increase the damage you deal and also take a percentage of the damage you deal with your weapons and convert it into focus. And you can upgrade this with Draining Whip, where eventually you get 100% focus gain. So if I deal 50 damage with my weapon attack, I gain 50 focus to cast my spells. You get the idea. Now, as long as the combat is still going, that means there are enemies you can be attacking and dealing damage to, which means you can be generating focus. And that makes Cipher spells technically infinite. And other classes don't really get this. Other classes have a set amount of resources, and when they burn through them, they're done. Not the Cipher. The Cipher is a naturally infinite source of class resources. And then they get this tier 7 ability, Ancestor's Memory, which will put the Brilliant condition on an ally. Brilliant gives you +1 to your intellect, +1 to all power levels. That's already amazing right there. And then here's the really big deal. It gives you +1 to your class resources per 6 seconds. So it's returning class resources. And hopefully you can see how just logically this means that all of your classes now have infinite class resources, right? Because if you have an infinite source of class resources that can return class resources to other classes, now all classes are technically infinite with their resources. And the game was not built for this. It's balanced around you being limited. And Ciphers make you unlimited. Especially in long, grind-em-out fights, Ciphers are just invaluable. And some of the toughest fights in this game are long, grind-em-out boss fights. That is the fundamentally game-breaking thing about Chanters. It interacts extremely potently with other classes, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But for now, just know that what makes Cipher's game-breaking is the combination of Focus being infinite and Ancestor's Memory. So, alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about what this class does besides all of that. And honestly, it's still pretty good. As a weapon striker, it's kind of meh unless you're going Soul Blade. We'll talk about Soul Blade in a bit. But, I mean, you're getting like plus 20% damage from Draining Whip. This will scale with power level, I believe, so it ends up being a fair amount, but still not that much compared to what actual weapon striking classes are giving you. You do get Hammering Thoughts, that's +1 penetration with your weapons. Again, good. Actually, that's quite good, but not enough to overcome what other classes are giving you. Basically, on the passive side of things, it gives you some bonuses to your weapon striking, so you can multi-class it as a weapon striker, but all of that is really just about generating focus. The powerful things you can do with this class are in its spells. And its most powerful spells are all single target, both crowd control and damage. For damage, there is Disintegrate. When you hit this on a target, you will deal an absurd amount of raw damage. It scales very well with intelligence. Raw damage cannot be mitigated by armor. It completely bypasses armor. And so, in theory, there's no way to stop a Cipher from killing you. If he can hit Disintegrate, if his accuracy is high enough, he just kills you. Now, that's not entirely true. Of course, you can avoid it with defenses, so that's why the main interaction becomes stacking accuracy on your Cipher, right? However, if you're fighting an enemy that has a very high resolve reduces the duration of incoming debuffs and spell effects like Disintegration. When you max out your hostile effect reduction, it really reduces the damage on Disintegrate quite a bit. So there's this thing where there's a boss in this game called Dugan, and he has very high armor, and so your instinct is, well, I'll just cast Disintegration on him and bypass his armor altogether. But then he also has an absurdly high resolve, and so you're casting Disintegration and it's lasting like 1 second and you're getting barely any damage from it. So those are the two main loops. If you can find a way to reliably hit, and you can find a way to reduce enemy hostile effect reduction, then you've completely hacked their defenses and Disintegrate will just eat them away. One of the best single target damage spells in the game right here. And then when it comes to single target CC, they have spells like Puppet Master. This will dominate a target. You can think of dominate because what it does is it takes an enemy and makes them your ally. It's basically a summon, right? Except it's a summon that you're stealing from the other side. So it's kind of like having two summons, and the more powerful of an enemy that you hit it on, the more powerful of that equation is, where you're taking one from them and plus one to you. Very powerful, very easy to overlook. Puppet Master stays relevant the entire game. And even early game, you can get a baby version of it, which is Whispers of Treason, which still is kind of relevant because you can get a lot of duration from it from PL scaling, and it only costs 10 focus, very cheap. That is fundamentally what the Cipher offers. There's other things I'd like to touch on here, like Borrowed Instinct, Driving Echoes, Defensive Mind Web, but I can only talk about so much in this video. I'll make other videos about the Cipher in the future, I'm sure. If we go to subclasses now, there's some very interesting options. All of these are good in their own way. Probably Ascendant and Scion are the best. However, I want to talk about Ascendant and Soulblade. So starting with Ascendant, this creates this interesting loop where you have a debuff on the spells, which lasts for as long as you don't have max focus. However, once you achieve max focus, you get the Ascended buff, which makes all of your spells free to cast and massively buffs the power of your spells. I believe it gives you plus 3 power level to all Cipher spells. And that's really, really good. It creates this kind of rhythm to the class where you want to attack a lot at the beginning, get Ascended status, and cast as many spells as you can, and even try to extend Ascended if you can. So Ascendant are very powerful spellcasters. The next up is Soulblade. Soulblade is the kind of multi-class weapon striker version and one of my personal favorite classes in the game. It gets this ability, Soul Annihilation. What it does is you make an attack with a melee weapon that's going to expend all of the focus that you've gathered. So your focus goes down to 0. And then it's going to deal raw damage. It says 10 raw damage. Ignore that. It actually deals 10 base plus a percentage of the amount of focus you've expended. I think the base percentage is 1/4. So if you expend 100 focus on Soul Annihilation, it will deal 25 raw damage plus the 10 raw damage base for a total of 35 raw damage. And that sounds pretty bad to you probably, and you'd be right, except the percentage increases with power level and with weapon damage bonuses. And what this means is if you stack enough weapon damage bonuses, you can change that percent from 1/4 to like double or quadruple the amount of focus you can spend. The best class to do this with, or one of the most fun classes to do this with, is Assassin, because Assassins get a ton of flat bonuses to their damage on a backstab attack. I've dealt upwards of 700 raw damage on a Soul Annihilation attack late game with an Assassin Soulblade. It's really, really good. I've actually experimented with so many Soulblade builds. For my Patreons, I wrote an entire article which made a unique optimized Soulblade build for every single faction of the game. It's just so fun to mess around with. It's probably not optimal because why expend your resources casting Soul Annihilation when you can cast Disintegration instead? But, it's the martial version of the Cipher, and that's very cool. I really enjoy it. Alright, gotta move on now to Druid. Druid is going into bread and butter. Druids are really the jack-of-all-trades class in this game. By the way, I just want to mention, while I have tested all of these classes extensively, Druid and Barbarian are definitely my weakest, so I just want to let you guys know that as a disclaimer. Druids are very good all-around spellcasters. They get good buffs, great healing. They're probably the best healers in the game. They get some amazing offensive spells. They're just kind of like a wizard, right? They just do a lot of wizard-like things. But then they also get this Spirit Shift ability. Spirit Shift is a once-per-encounter ability where you turn into like a were animal. So it could be a werebear, wereboar, werewolf, werecat, werestag. All of these have their own unique bonuses. I haven't done all of the math on them, but the way I think about it is Cat is probably the best offensive one. So if you want the Spirit Shift to deal damage, pick Cat. If you want it just to add some tankiness while you cast spells, Bear is probably the best. Boar is also fine. I haven't tested between bear and boar, really. I just kind of assume bear is best, so I don't know. An expert can correct me in all of this, but... Now, in Pillars of Eternity 1, Druids were probably my favorite class in the game, and I think one of the best classes... I mean, Priest is probably the best class in Pillars of Eternity 1, and to me, Druid is a close second. And Druids in that game were just amazing spellcasters. They were full casters that were on par with a wizard, and then they'd have the spirit shift, and when they spirit shifted, they could deal like weapon DPS that was on par with like an optimized rogue. Like their weapon DPS was insane, and a lot of that had to do with their elemental lashes. You get elemental damage on your attacks, and it's the same in this game as it was in the original Pillars of Eternity. But in the original Pillars of Eternity, the way math worked for lashes allowed for some very exploitable damage, and Druid Spirit Shifts got very high percentage lashes on very strong and quick attacks, and you could just DPS like a crazy amount. Anyways, that is the other game. That's Pillars 1. In Pillars Deadfire, the Spirit Shift has been pretty significantly nerfed from my experience. Maybe there's a way to really make it deal strong damage in Spirit Shift, but I haven't found it. And so as a result, I end up just using Spirit Shift as a little bit of tankiness for casting spells. And Druids are now solidly just a spell casting class, in my opinion. But their spells are really good. Don't get me wrong. They have, like I've been saying, some of the best healing. If there's a healing spell in this list, it's probably one of the best in the game. Nature's Vigor is really good. Moonwell is extremely good. This creates a healing over time effect on the ground. And it also gives people a water keyworded buff. With the way keywords work, water keyword defensive buff will counteract a fire keyworded offensive attack. So if you have a Dragon Breath that would one-tap your backline, casting Moonwell on them will completely cancel the damage from the Dragon Breath attack. So that can be really, really good in certain situations. Garden of Life. I believe Garden of Life is the most exploitable heal in the game. I haven't messed around with it, but I've heard people talk about it a lot. It seems like it's really, really powerful. Anyways, just all-around amazing healers. They also are amazing damage dealers, and especially in the mid-game, the core of your damage is going to come from your lightning spells. These are equivalent of Call Lightning from the original game, spells like Returning Storm, Relentless Storm. These deal lightning damage and kind of radius around you, and they will also stun targets, which adds some CC. The fact that it's happening as like a passive aura effect is really good. Then they have their insect line of spells. Insect Swarm will deal some raw damage, which is, you'll never say no to. It also cancels enemy concentration. That could be quite strong, especially for interrupt locking bosses. Plague of Insects deals a lot of raw damage. When enemies hit you with the Plague of Insects, it feels like you just completely melts your backline. Very powerful. And then the creme de la creme, Great Maelstrom. This spell, big AoE, crazy damage. You basically can't avoid it because it deals 4 types of damage in theory. It's insanely good. It has all of the keywords, really, really powerful damage spell, Greater Maelstrom. Even Avenging Storm, there's some really cool things you can do with this. Can't get into all of it now, but good damage, good healing. They have some good summons in the game, especially when we look at subclasses. We might as well get to that now. The Ancient subclass for Druid is one of my personal favorites, not because it's like super strong, I just really like it. It gets this unique Summon Sporelings ability, and later the ability to Wild Growth buff either your Sporelings or any other beast or primordial summon. And besides, these Sporelings are just really powerful for when you get them and absolutely adorable. You could also go Life Giver subclass, which greatly improves the rejuvenation spells that you cast, which is all of those really amazing healing spells that we talked about. So if we return to the tier list, Druid just does everything you want pretty well, but they have no particular niche where they shine except for healing. But to me, healing is one of those things where you don't really need to overdo it. You just need enough of it. I don't know what to say about Druid. A single class Druid is welcome in pretty much every party. It'll always plug in very well. You cannot go wrong with it, so just have fun with the class. Next up on our list is Fighter. Fighter is going into overloaded tier, and Fighter is probably my favorite class in this game, and it's definitely going to be my most controversial ranking. Now, I believe I'm going to have a very special guest, and maybe we'll debate this fighter ranking. So let me just give you my best case right now for why I think the fighter is overloaded tier. To be honest, I'm putting fighter in overload tier, but I think it is borderline game-breaking tier. I don't think it's quite as game-breaking as Cipher or the other class I'm going to be putting up there, but it's close. It's close. So let's talk about the two features that fighters get, which are really game-breaking. The first is this power, Unbending. Unbending is a self-healing ability, which will convert a percentage of the damage that you take into healing. And it doesn't sound that good when you just read it here, but once you dive into the actual math of this ability, you realize that under very achievable conditions, you can build to make Unbending an invincibility button. By the way, it upgrades to Unbending Trunk. This is the version I recommend. It's difficult for me to explain in detail how the math for this works, but the gist is that counterintuitively, it scales extremely well with intelligence. The more intelligence you get, the greater this number is going to be, and also the longer duration of the healing buff you get. Longer duration means more healing, but it also means you hold on to the buffs, and there's a weird thing that happens where every time you take a new instance of damage, it's going to proc all of the buffs that you're currently holding on to. So if I could just walk through an example, this is going to sound complicated, but hopefully I can show a clip to show you how this works. If I cast Unbending and I take 100 damage, what's going to happen is it will generate a healing condition, which is going to have a healing value per proc, and then a duration for how many procs you're going to get over time. The first instance you take damage, you're going to take an initial proc of that value, right? So that value is determined by a percentage of the initial damage. It's difficult to go into all how that percentage is calculated, but just trust me on this. Let's just say, for the sake of easy math, that in that 100 damage I just took, the proc I get is 10 damage, and it's going to go for a duration that will eventually give me 5 procs. So over time, I'm expected to heal the initial proc of 10 plus another 5, so 60 damage out of that 100 damage I dealt. Cool, right? That's 60%. However, let's say immediately after taking that 100 damage, I take another instance of 10 damage from a different source. Now, using the same math, that 10 damage is going to convert into an initial proc of 1, and then 5 more, so it's going to be healing 6 over time. However, when that initial proc of 1 ticks, it's for some reason also going to tick all of the other ones I'm holding on to. So that 10 I'm holding on to from the 100 damage, that is going to tick as well. So when I take that 10 damage, the 10 healing is going to proc, and then the 1 healing is going to proc, and I'm going to heal 11, and I just out-healed that 10 damage I took. So you get the idea, the longer you can hold on to your instances of healing, and the more sources of low damage you take, you can very quickly drastically out-heal all incoming damage. And with enough intelligence on your Unbending, you will become functionally invincible. Alright, so here's that clip of the fighter using Unbending that I was talking about. Sorry about the video quality. I made this clip years and years ago before I was really a YouTuber, So this fight is against Nemnock, one of the late game bosses. I was testing a solo brawler build, so this is a monk fighter combo. Now you can see here I'm taking damage, and the reason I'm taking damage is because Arcane Suspension, so I'm going to have to use my cleansing ability to cleanse the time on this, and I'm just kind of avoiding damage until my healing starts up, and there it just started back up. Now watch this. Okay, did you see that? When I took the magic missile, you can see all of the healing numbers here. I heal after each attack, and you can see the value of my heal slowly going up for each one. This is how Unbending works, right? So for each little instance of damage, my healing improves. If we keep the clip going, take him down. Now you can see I'm starting to take heavier instances of damage, but I have collected so many stacks of Unbending. You can see my healing values are insane. 71, 79, 93, 97, 103. So here's a good example where they did 69 damage to me. That's actually quite a bit in this game, but I'm healing for 93. So at this point, no matter how much damage they deal to me, I'm going to be out healing it for as long as Unbending is up. The only time I could die is if I ran out of discipline to cast Unbending. That's the only time it ever happened. But fighters are also a class which gives you one of the best ways of returning class resources, so you never actually have to run out of discipline if you're playing in a full party. So let's look at that now, go to the subclasses. So this right here, the Tactician subclass, is the other borderline game-breaking feature that fighters get. If we go to Tactician here, so Tactician gets this Tactician passive, which will restore discipline anytime we interrupt an enemy action, so you're returning discipline that way. You will also gain the Brilliant Tactician power, which is this. While all enemies you are fighting are flanked, and none of your allies are flanked, you gain the Brilliant Inspiration, and it lasts for as long as this condition is true, right? You also get the drawback of Tactical Dilemma. While you are flanked, you get the Shaken and Confused afflictions, and those are pretty potent, and that adds up. So you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, it's a very strong bonus, but also a very steep drawback. How often is it in a fight that you are able to flank all enemies while none of your allies are flanked? That's pretty hard to achieve, right? I mean, honestly, it depends, right? How many enemies are you facing? If you drastically outnumber your enemies, like for example, if you're fighting a single big boss, it is trivially easy to get the Brilliant condition. So in boss fights or fights against a low amount of enemies, you can reliably get Brilliant, and now you'll never run out of discipline for Unbending. You can start spamming Mule Kick, which is your very easy interrupt, which is also going to completely refund its cost, and you can just interrupt lock that boss, and it makes fighters one of the best boss fighting tanks in the game. And remember, they're already an insane mob fighting tank because of Unbending. Unbending makes it so you want to take lots of instances of small damage, right? And that's what you get when you're fighting a mob. And there's other things that fighters get which make them really good against mobs, like for example, Mob Stance. Mob Stance is one of 3 stances that you could toggle between. There's Mob, Conqueror, and Guardian. Mob is the best one. I pretty much always leave it on. When you are in Mob Stance, there's 2 things that happen. First, whenever you kill a target, you will proc an instant new attack on a separate target. So again, it's kind of like the Barbarian's Bloodthirst. You're just getting an instant injection into your action economy. Already very, very strong, especially when there's mobs, lots of enemies for you to kill and proc bonus attacks. Moreover, when it's upgraded, you will get a -5 stacking recovery per threatened target. So if you build up lots of ways to get engagement, you can stack this, and this actually synergizes really well with several items in the game. For example, Reckless Brigandine is a set of armor you can get fairly early in the game, which will give you basically the same effect. So now you're getting this ×2. It adds up to a lot of recovery reduction, which makes your attack speed very, very respectable. It's one of the more powerful attack speed boosts in the game in my experience. There's also certain weapons in the game that will not only increase your engagement, but give you more damage per hit, depending on how many targets you've engaged. So Mob Stance is good in itself, and then it synergizes really well with several item sets. So the combination of Unbending and Mob Stance makes fighters really, really strong against mobs. The combination of Brilliant Tactician and Mule Kick makes you really strong against bosses. What you end up with is a class that is unkillable, is actually deals really high damage, and is weak in pretty much 0 scenarios. There's a lot of other boosts that we can talk about with this class, like for example, Discipline Strikes. This is a 1 discipline cost source of intuitive and concentration. The intuitive buff gives you +5 to your perception, so that's +5 accuracy and +10 reflex. It converts 50% of your grazes into hits. It's very easy to overlook how good this is, because grazes don't happen very often. However, when they do happen, they reduce your damage by a lot, with inversion math, which I'm going to link a guide in the description to that explains it better than I ever could, a 50% damage reduction from grazes actually ends up being 100% damage reduction, which isn't actually 100% damage reduction. It's difficult to explain, but again, please check out Theelee's guide, which I'll have linked in the comments and in the description. Graze to hit, very, very important. It also gives you 25 hit to crit. All of these together just makes you a really reliable striker, both for spells and weapons. But definitely fighters shine as weapon strikers, because they'll also get confident aim for another 30% graze to hit. This is actually 15% when you stack it with intuitive, but still good. It's a 65% total, which is excellent. Anyways, I will probably talk about this more in this video when I discuss with my guest, but also in other videos in the future. But I really feel like the fighter is just an invincible class that also offers one of the best weapon striking kits and is also one of the best sources of brilliant in the game. And that is borderline game breaking. It's easily within overloaded in my opinion. So let's talk about, do you want to multi-class a fighter or do you want to single class it? Now, most people will tell you multi-class, and I basically agree. I do think multi-class tends to be better, although I do think people underestimate single-class fighters. So if we just look at the advantages of single-class, fighters don't get that many great things in the last two tiers, but I do want to highlight some of them. The first is Sundering Blow. This is a very cheap discipline cost attack, which not only gets bonus penetration, but also will lower the enemy armor rating by 4 for 15 seconds, but you're going to extend this a lot because you always want to invest in intelligence for fighters. It's their most important stat. Lowering armor rating by 4 on a boss is kind of like buffing your entire party's penetration by 4, and that's extremely good. Do not overlook Sundering Blow. It's actually a very good ability, especially against bosses. Fighters will also get the Clear the Path or Clean Sweep line. I actually haven't experimented with this much, but there are some very, very well written and explored guides to these abilities on the Pillars of Eternity, Deadfire, Obsidian forums. So you can go check out those there. There's just some very corny things you can do by layering Area of Effect onto these. It's very good. And one power I'm really interested in is Take the Hit. So what this says that it does is it reduces in ally damage taken in the Area of Effect by 15%. But that damage is redirected to the caster as raw damage. And it's a 1 discipline cost, so very cheap discipline cost. In theory, you can spam this. Now, because of how Unbending works, fighters can 100% tank that damage. And I don't know how the math works for having the damage taken, but if this benefits from inversion math, this minus 15% damage is actually doubled. And I tested this, but it was so long ago, I can't remember the results. And I can't find anyone else who's tested it. So, yeah, so caveat on this one, this might be good or it might be mediocre. But definitely the best thing that fighters get from single classing is just more power level to benefit from more power level, which will benefit Unbending. And then you just reach the Unbending threshold sooner. And then they're pretty complete as a class. They have pretty much everything they want. Tons of durability, tons of crowd control, and of course, tons of weapon striking bonuses. That said, because there aren't that many really good features in tiers 8 and 9, you're probably best off multi-classing the fighter, and I've explored many multi-classes with them. They work good multi-classed with casters, but monks are probably better to be your caster multi-class. The big reason to pick a fighter for a caster is Discipline Strike. So spammable concentration and intuitive for casters, very, very good. That said, I usually prefer to combine fighters with other martial classes. There's 3 that stand out. Fighter Barbarian, which is called the Brute class, is really, really good. It turns out that even though the fighter and the barbarian kind of overlap in what they do, they overlap in ways that synergize with each other. And so what you get is this insane mob killer, like caster levels of AoE damage on your attacks, and your ability to proc disengagement attacks through Terrified is just unparalleled. Oh, by the way, fighters get Overbearing Guard. This further boosts your disengagement attacks. I believe it boosts it up to plus 35 accuracy and plus 150 damage when you add all of the boosts together, which is an absurd amount. So yeah, you get Terrified from Barbarian, you stack up Engagement, you proc Terrified, which procs Carnage, which procs Bloodthirst, which procs Mob Stance, which procs even more Bloodthirst, and you just become a wrecking ball against mobs. And then against bosses, you're still pretty good, because you can still go Brilliant Tactician, and you can still interrupt targets and all of that. So Brute is good. Brawler is really, really good. That is the mix of Fighter and Barbarian. We'll talk more about that when I get to the Barbarian class. But I think my personal favorite, I'm not sure it's the best, but it's up there, and definitely my favorite, is Swashbuckler. And we'll talk about Swashbuckler when I get to the Rogue class. Anyways, just to finish off the subclasses for Fighter, all of their subclasses are cool and interesting, but my next favorite that I want to discuss is the Devoted. Because Tactician is so good, like, you should always, always, always pick Tactician, unless you're just bored of playing Tacticians, which is kind of where I'm at right now. And when I'm not playing Tactician, I play Devoted. Devoted is devoted to one weapon. They pick a single weapon proficiency, and they get these bonuses to the weapon. So they get a flat +2 penetration, which stacks with everything, and they get +25 crit damage. Now, remember, you're likely to crit with fighters, because first off, Discipline Strikes. Intuitive is giving you 25% hit to crit and +5 to your accuracy, but also Overbearing Guard, a +35 to your accuracy on disengagement attacks, is likely to make it a crit. So fighters crit often, and this is giving you +25 crit damage, which is basically doubling your crit damage. These two bonuses together are really, really good, but you're only getting them on one single weapon, and a lot of enemies are immune to weapon damage, certain weapon damage types. And without a way to vary your weapon damage, it's supposed to be a pretty severe drawback, but in practice, it just isn't. First off, there's tons of weapons in this game that have varied damage types, even if the base weapon only has one. So a great example, take spears. I've done a Devoted spear run. One of the best DPS weapons in this game is a spear. You can throw that on Devoted. The weapon scales super well with crits. Devoted do really well with crits. You can just start crit chaining and kill everything. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing, but it only does pierce damage. So what if you encounter an enemy, like say skeletons, which are immune to pierce damage? Well, you can always swap to Moharatanga, another spear you get in this game, and Moharatanga does slash and pierce. So now you have varied weapon damage. Even if you have a creature that's really resistant to both slash and pierce, every character in this game is automatically proficient in unarmed strikes. And what you can do is pick this ability, Monastic Unarmed Training, which is going to make your unarmed strikes pretty good and scale with your power level. And you can always count on bludgeoning attacks to do damage. There's very few creatures in this game which are immune to bludgeoning strikes. So even if you pick, like, for example, spears on your Devoted, you're also going to be proficient in fists. Everyone is automatically. So if something is immune to your piercing damage and you don't want to use Moharatanga, you can always just switch to your fists and just bypass enemy immunities that way. So I have done full playthroughs with, I think, 6 or 7 different types of Devoted. I've never had problems dealing damage. So in effect, you just get these bonuses for free, and the bonuses are actually quite good. So anyways, enough gushing about Fighter. Let's move on now to Monk. Monk is another class going into Overloaded. I'll probably put it here. Let's look at the Monk now. Okay, Monk. Monk is so well designed in this game. The things you can do with this class, it's just, it just feels so elegant, and it really, if you aren't convinced that this is one of the best tactical games, play a Monk, because then you will see. The first awesome thing that Monks get is definitely Monk Fists. Monks get this ability called Transcendent Suffering, which is going to add to your damage and accuracy and penetration on your unarmed attacks, and it's going to scale with your power level. It scales very, very, very well with your power level. If you stack class agnostic power level on monks, they eventually get just one punch fists. It's so cool. Your damage is insane. I consider monk fists with good power level builds to be one of the best weapons in the game. So that's the first thing that monks offer. And then they get On top of all that, Swift Strikes. Swift Strikes will give you the quick condition, which adds +5 to dexterity, plus another +15 to your action speed. Add these both together, and that's a +30 to your action speed. That's a lot, right? So by comparison, for a mob stance, you need to be engaged to 5 targets to get the equivalent of Swift Strikes, and you can just activate this for 1 mortification. Very, very cool. And then Swift Strikes is going to upgrade into 2 good variants. One just gives you extra shock damage, and that's as a lash, and that's cool. The much better and more interesting one, in my opinion, is Swift Flurry. With Swift Flurry, you have a 33% chance to trigger another automatic strike whenever you crit with a melee weapon, like, for example, your fists. That's going to synergize with the Heartbeat Drumming passive that monks get, which gives them another 25% chance. You add all these together and you're getting close to 40% chance to trigger an instant attack on a critical hit. And that instant attack can also be a critical hit, which can trigger another Heartbeat Drumming, and you can start chaining together crits to just do nuclear damage with your fists. So this is the main area of sort of weapon striking you can do with monks, is to go Transcendent Suffering, Swift Flurry, Heartbeat Drumming to just be an amazing weapon striker. They're really, really good for that. And all of these abilities come in at 7 power level or under. So you can multi-class them and get all of this as well. Very, very good. But that's not even close to everything monks get. They also get a lot of stat bonuses that make them good as a multi-class, particularly for casters, I find. So the first to talk about with that is Duality of Mortal Presence. Now, the way monks work is they have 2 class resources. Mortification, which functions just like a normal class resource like Discipline or Rage, where you start a battle with a certain amount and you expend it as you use mortification abilities like Swift Flurry. The other class resource they get is called Wounds, and usually you generate wounds by taking damage, although it will vary from subclass to subclass. We'll talk about that in a bit. However, it's easy to gather wounds. You can do it pretty easily, regardless of your subclass. And what Duality of Mortal Presence does is it's going to give you a bonus to your intellect or constitution equal to the amount of wounds you have. So at max 10 wounds, that's a +10 to either constitution or intellect. Intellect is definitely the most exploitable bonus. So this is a toggle. You can toggle on and off, but eventually you can upgrade them to Iron Wheel, which will also give you bonuses to your armor that scales with your wounds, or the much better Turning Wheel, which will give you burn damage which scales with your wounds, and which will max out at +20 burn damage lash on your attacks, which is very good, and just synergizes even more with your weapon striking kit. Now, what can you do with +10 intellect? There is so much you can do with +10 intellect. Pretty much every class in this game benefits from intellect. I consider it the strongest attribute in the game in Deadfire. Think about the fighter class, which we just talked about. +10 to intellect is going to send your scaling on unbending into the stratosphere. If you're a druid or a wizard or a cipher, all of that intellect is going to make your spells just hit like a truck and last forever. I mean, monks are good in pretty much every single multiclass in the game, mostly because of this +10 to their intellect. But that's not all they get either. If we go to their subclasses, there's also the Hellwalker subclass, which will give you a +1 to your might per wound you have. So with the Hellwalker, you're getting +10 to your might, +10 to your intelligence, but the might bonus actually is in this passive tree, and things in the passive tree always stack with active abilities. So you can stack that +10 with Thunderous Blows, which will give you Tenacious, another +5 might, to have a very reliable +15 to your might and +10 to your intelligence. And that is good on pretty much every class imaginable. It's so insane what you can do with that. It's just such a massive passive boost. So there's a few directions you can build a multi-class monk. You can go full in as a weapon striker, because they have one of the best weapons in the game. They have Swift Flurry, Heartbeat Drumming, Turning Wheel for their fire lash damage. You can go Hellwalker and Thunderous Blows, and stack that with another class like, say, a rogue or a fighter. Caster monks, also amazing. You can just keep them in the back. use Enduring Dance. Now you get up to plus 15 accuracy. You're getting plus 10 intelligence from Duality of Mortal Presence, and you can just start casting spells that way. Really, really cool. And then finally, single class monk is probably better than all of that, because monks get some awesome abilities in tier 8 and 9. One of them is Razor's Edge. This will give you accuracy per wound, which stacks with all the other accuracy in the game. So at 10 wounds with fully stacked Enduring Dance, that's plus 25 accuracy total on your unarmed strikes. Amazing. You're going to get way more power level, right? So remember, multi-class caps at 7 power level. If you go single class, you're going to get 2 more here and here. And then you can also take Prestige, which gives you a third. Plus 3 power level is going to buff your fists by a lot, so that's even more damage on your weapon attacks. And then you get abilities like Whispers of the Wind. This is a jumping attack where you go invisible and attack every target in an AoE. There's some very cheesy stuff you can do with this, especially if you have like AoE attacking weapons or bouncing weapons, or both. You can get both if you have blunderbusses. A double blunderbuss Whispers of the Wind monk is like a comet. It just clears mobs like crazy, and it's very cool to see. But even if you just stick with your fist, this is a ton of damage. And the fact that you're invisible when you make these attacks allows you to stack with the Adjumant Hunting Cloak to stun targets as well. So it's an AoE stun, potentially. Very, very strong. And then there's Resonant Touch, which is going to apply a stack of resonance each time you deal damage to an enemy. And then you can use Resonant Touch ability to consume those stacks, and it will deal 15 damage, raw damage per stack. An insanely good boss killer power. You just can't go wrong with monks. If we return to our tier list now, yeah, monks they're pretty much the definition of overloaded. When I made the overloaded tier, I had monks in mind because they just give you so much. Oh man, I totally forgot to talk about subclasses. So we talked about Hellwalker. The other one I want to talk to you guys about is Forbidden Fist, which is probably my favorite. It changes the monk so that they no longer gain wounds for taking damage. Instead, they're going to gain wounds each time a hostile effect expires. And then they get this ability, Forbidden Fist, which gives them a way to stack hostile effects to generate wounds. Forbidden Fist is just a standard melee attack. However, it also can spread the Enfeebled condition. Enfeebled is one of the most valuable debuffs in the game. You always want to look for sources of Enfeebled, and you want to look for sources of Terrify. Those are the two of the best ones in the game, in my opinion. The reason Enfeebled is so good is it cancels enemy healing, which is nice. That can be good in certain situations. But the big thing is it increases the duration of hostile effects, and that's really good. It actually increases the duration of your Enfeebled effect when you apply it. But then any kind of debuff, like a charm, or any damage over time, like a disintegration, these all scale so well with increased duration. And this adds a whole other 50% duration on top of everything else. And it's really, really strong. It's one of the key strategies of the game is to get Enfeebled on a target and then just debuff that target to infinity. For experienced players, it's like Salvation of Time, but with debuffs, and that's so good. And Forbidden Fist is the earliest and most spammable source of Enfeebled in the entire game. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. So that's the big reason I always pick Forbidden Fist. I mean, it's hard to pass on Hellwalker for sure, and changing the way wounds work is annoying, but you can just get wounds from Enduring Dance, or you can just spam Forbidden Fist. And by the way, using Forbidden Fist more often actually increases the damage, and if you start spamming them, you can start dealing some very serious damage, although you also hurt yourself when you do it, so keep it in mind. Very cool subclass Forbidden Fist. Okay, enough said about Monk. Now let's move on to Paladin. Paladin is going into niche tier, which is a shame because I really, really love this class. From a roleplay perspective, I think it's one of the most fun in the game, and it's really the class that got me into Deadfire. I'd say my first 130 hours in this game was just spent trying to perfect the Paladin. Alright, so if we look at the Paladin tree, what is the niche for the Paladin? So the Paladin is primarily a tank, which also offers some pretty good support abilities. Let's look at them now. The big one is your aura effects. You can have a toggleable aura, which will grant either +5 accuracy, I can't remember. It's like a plus 15% stride. I can't remember how much that is. And I think it's like a +1 to your endurance, something like that. +1 to your armor rating. And then you can eventually upgrade these. So for defensive ones, +1 armor rating and +3 health restored. Exalted focus, +5 accuracy, and +5% hit to crit. So these can definitely add up. They're really great for your team. They're low buffs, but they're always on. And there's definitely something to be said for that. And then the Paladin's going to get a lot of Lay on Hands and Exhortation abilities. So Lay on Hands is an active heal. You touch a target and it's healed, and you can actually upgrade it quite a bit. Greater Lay on Hands heals initial burst, which scales really, really well. Don't be fooled by +20, because power level scaling plus might scaling will make this way higher than that. It also will give you the robust condition, which increases your armor rating and gives you even more healing over time. So a very good heal there. Exhortations are similar. They're usually reactive things, like for example, a revive. If a target dives, you revive them, they get back up in the fight. Or liberating exhortation suspends hostile effects for 20 seconds. So again, really good. And some of them will have little buffs on top of them. Like my problem, I'm kind of philosophically opposed to this line of abilities because I find them to be very reactive. It's hard. This is just kind of a meta principle in all RPGs. But in general, you can ask yourself, do I want to heal damage or do I want to deal damage? And of course, you always want to deal damage if you have the choice between the two. Because dealing damage will kill targets, which not only is how you clear an encounter, but killing targets is also going to subtract them from the fight and effectively mitigate all the damage they would have dealt if they were alive. So killing targets is actually going to mitigate more damage than healing, especially if you're spending your action to heal. And so if you're going to be healing, like I've said, healing is very good in this game. You'd prefer action economy cheap heals, which have a lot of passive effects like Old Sake, like Blood Ward, like Unbending. All of these are very cheap from an action economy perspective. And Lay on Hands isn't. It's actually taking your actions to do it. You'd rather be spending your actions dealing damage. To a certain extent, the same goes for exhortations. I really like liberating exhortations. Suspending hostile effects is quite valuable. Like if one of your allies gets charmed, you just want to hit them with this. If they get paralyzed, you want to hit them with this as fast as you can. A lot of people are hyped on reviving exhortation. I personally do not like it. I don't like having to revive allies. I'd rather just prevent them from dying by whatever means necessary. Now, of course, situations can occur and targets can die. But when that happens, if you have someone in your party with Arcana, there are scrolls in the game that can revive targets. They're not as good as this, but they're good enough. And then the important thing is whenever a target gets downed and you revive them, they're going to get a debuff, which lasts until your next long rest. And I hate those. Not because the debuffs are particularly potent. You can usually fight through them. But it's just, this is a game where you really want to minimize long rests. Not for the same reasons that we minimize long rests in Baldur's Gate 3. Because this is a fight where resources happen per encounter. So it's not actually cheating to rest in this game like it is in Baldur's Gate 3. However, there are all kinds of buffs in this game which last until your next long rest. And it's really powerful if you can stack them. Like, we're talking really, really, really good buffs. You get them on your character and you can't get them again, which means once you have them, you just want to keep them for the entire game. And if you're forced to rest, you lose them, right? So that's why you want to minimize long rests. And a strategy that revolves around reviving members just cannot do that. So yeah, I try to just like not even have reviving exhortation. If I need to revive, I just use scroll. So that's my opinion on that. And that's kind of the big problem with the Paladin, is I just think as a design, their kind of reactive supporting and healing is just not really worth taking. And as far as everything else they get, it's not that great. I mean, at least in actives. Some of their passives are really good, but their actives, like what they spend zeal on, there's not a lot. I mean, one thing you can spend zeal on is dealing damage, and they do have Flames of Devotion, which you can upgrade to deal quite a bit of burn damage. This is a +20, I think +30 burn damage lash, and this will scale with your power level, so it actually scales very, very highly, and it's 1 zeal, which means you can spam this like crazy. especially because Divine Retribution, if you have a single class Paladin, you gain +2 of each Paladin of your Paladin resource each time a ally dies, and this will include ally summons. So if you have a Chanter that's chanting all those skeletons that just die like crazy, you have effectively created Infinite Zeal, so you can spam Flames of Devotion, and you can get a fair amount of fire damage on your attacks. I mean, it adds up. They also get Sacred Immolation, which does like a pulsing fire aura, and that can definitely add up as well. There's Brand Enemy, which does persistent fire damage over time. Lots of sources of fire damage. I mean, they're the only kind of martial class that gets Scion of the Flame that I know of. Scion of the Flame gives you +1 penetration to your fire attacks, and you can do this really interesting thing if you invest in Arcana, where you can use the Arcana scrolls to summon the Firebrand Greatsword, which is a weapon that's keyworded fire. So it will benefit from this +1 penetration. It will also benefit from certain items in the game which increase the power of your fire, keyworded fire abilities. And then it has a huge Fire Lash, which stacks with these Fire Lashes, and all of that adds up to quite a lot of fire damage, to be honest. Like, it's respectable. The problem is, it's all fire damage. And there's just tons of enemies in this game that are completely immune to fire damage. I mean, there's Fire Blights, there is Flame Naga. There's a lot of big Flame Naga fights. They're just immune to it. You really want to vary your damage in this game, and Paladins just don't. They kind of share this problem with base class Clerics as well. So Paladins aren't your best option for damage dealing. I kind of don't like their reactive healing. So what is their niche? Well, their niche is stacking defenses and armor. They have some of the best passive abilities for stacking defenses and armor in the game. So for example, Deep Faith. Well, let's start with Faith and Conviction. This gives you +8 to all your defenses, and it will increase the way as you stack relevant reputations to your Paladin, which will vary depending on your Paladin subclass. Deep Faith will increase it even more. You're going to get abilities like Inspired Defense. This is +1 armor rating when you're taking damage, which is always, you should always be taking damage. Stoic Steel increases your armor when you're standing still even more, which again, you're the kind of class that can just stand still and tank aggro. And then Inspiring Triumph. Whenever you kill a target, all allies are going to get even more bonuses to their defenses, which is pretty good as well. The thing about passive bonuses to your defenses is they stack really well with other things. So if you want to make a build which is all around avoiding hits or stacking armor rating, Paladin is just the way to go. The thing is that's kind of a niche strategy, to be honest. When you first play this game, it seems like it's really good, and Paladins will probably be your best tanks. But once you realize how you can exploit things like unbending or Chanter summons or strategies with the Priest, which we're about to talk about, you end up realizing that the Paladin's way of tanking is not the best way to tank. But it can still be good. There's ways that you can weaponize your defenses through the Rogue class, which we're going to talk about, and Paladins are the class to pair with Rogues to really capitalize on that. So they definitely have their niche. We'll talk about that more later. Let's talk about subclasses. So if we look at subclasses, lots of interesting options here. Kind Wayfarers are cool because their Flames of Devotion will start healing allies, which is actual passive healing. Because you want to be spamming Flames of Devotion anyways, as we've already talked about. And so now you're actually getting a lot of really good healing without having to spend your action doing it. So awesome. I love that. Shield Bearers of St. Elga. I mean, these guys are incredible. They get a bonus to their Lay on Hands, which prevents death. We're going to talk about that more when we get to the Cleric, because Clerics are the other classes that can do that. But prevents death does exactly what it says on the tin. When you have this effect, you cannot die. And so if you spam enough Lay on Hands, suddenly all members of your party cannot die. And then if you also have a summon composition that's returning Divine Retribution, then you can cast these on everyone infinitely, and now your whole team is invincible. Now you're probably thinking, if the Paladin can easily make your whole team invincible, why is it a niche tier? Isn't that game breaking? And I mean, yeah, it's game breaking. And if you put Paladin in game breaking tier just because of Shield Bearers of St. Elga, that's kind of a fair take, but my reasoning is that Making your whole party invincible is something you can do much easier and more efficiently with the priest, which we're going to talk about. And so the actual niche for the shield bearers isn't making your whole team invincible, it's doing it earlier in the game than the cleric, but clerics get it at like PL5 anyway, so it's not even that big of a problem. And then finally we get to the Steel Garrote. Steel Garrotes are amazing, one of my favorite classes to play. They get this really cool ability, which will... It's a lifesteal ability, like the ones we've talked about, but it only works for you, and it's going to restore a percentage of the weapon damage you deal against afflicted targets. And this is really good to pair with a rogue, and paladins already pair with rogues extremely well for riposte compositions. So yeah, Steel Garrote riposte builds are super fun and actually quite good. So anyways, that is the Paladin class. Moving on now to the Priest. Priests are going in the game-breaking tier, as I've kind of already alluded to. Let's look at their class. Okay, so here's the Priest tree. Priests do all the things that you would expect a priest to do, which they mostly have very good party buffs, and we're going to talk about those in a bit. But first, let's talk about the sets of buff that actually make them game-breaking. And the first one is this one, barring Death's Door. This creates a you cannot die effect on a target, on a single target that lasts for 8 seconds, but it's going to scale quite a bit with your intellect. You really want to max intellect on priests. While a target has this, they cannot die. They're literally invincible to death. The only way they technically can die is by accumulating wounds, but that's extremely niche and rare. There's like one boss in the game that actually deals direct wound damage to you, and there's easy ways to counter it. So effectively, if you have barring Death's Door, you never die. The duration is low, though, so the idea is you cast this on a party member that's close to dying in order to keep them alive long enough for you to heal them, right? I mean, sure, but you don't need to do that. Really, you can just keep barring Death's Door up always on everyone if you're willing to exploit some very simple interactions. The other major spell is this one, Salvation of Time. This will increase the duration of beneficial effects by 10 seconds. Of course, it scales with intelligence. And naturally, you can imagine, okay, I cast Barring Death's Door on one target, cast it on a second target, get both of them at the AoE of Salvation of Time, cast that twice, and now I have 2 people that are invincible for, say, 30 plus seconds. For a lot of fights, that's enough for you to solidly settle the fight. And then this can combine insanely well with the Death Godlike ability, Pallid Fate, where you get an increased +3 to your power level when you're near death. And with Barring Death's Door, you can be near death for forever, practically. +3 to your power level, unbelievable, insane. It's really great for monks and any kind of spellcaster. So, back to the leveling tree here. You cast Barring Death's Door, Salvation of Time, really, really strong. But what if you had a way to return class resources? Like, for example, with the Cipher. Well, now you could do all of that with Barring Death's Door and Salvation of Time, except the Cipher is giving you back those spells when you cast them, so you can cast them on your entire party, and you can keep spamming Salvation of Time until you have basically infinite duration, and then it doesn't matter if it takes you 14 days to kill an enemy. If you're doing even just a little bit of damage, and they can't kill you, you just win fights, the end. So it completely destroys the game. It removes all tactics. Once you get this combo, you never die. And unlike many of the really cheesy game-breaking combos in this game, this one obviously isn't a bug. This is working the way these spells were designed and intended by Obsidian. So yeah, that's why I kind of have this special game-breaking tier for these two classes, because if you have them in your party, theoretically, by like level 12 to 14 or something like that, you reach a we never die stage of the game, and that's just the end of it. Technically, everything else you've built for it is irrelevant now. But of course, that's so boring, I pretty much ban it from my runs. That's why I've made a special tier for it. However, even ignoring that really cheesy stuff, you can still do some very cool things. Like if you restrict yourself to only casting Barring Death's Door on a single target, you can do the Death Godlike strategy, which is super cool. Making one target unkillable it's just like unbending, right? Really, really powerful. Plus, Salvation of Time is just insane when it stacks with other buffs that aren't barring Death's Door. You can put it on the Ascended status. That's really cool. You can cast it on Blade Cascade, which is something you get from weapons. Salvation of Time on Blade Cascade is so fun. There's lots of really cool things you can do. So just having Salvation of Time already makes a cleric one of the best support classes in the game. And that's not even all of the support spells they get. They get some other incredible ones like Litany for the Spirit, one of my favorites. This gives you 60 seconds base of the Acute inspiration. Acute gives you +5 to your intellect. Awesome. +1 to your power levels. Yes, we'll take that on any kind of caster. 60 seconds base means that with power level scaling and intelligence scaling, this will basically never run out. So really strong on a single target. Then there's Triumph of the Crusaders, one of my favorite healing spells in the game. When you cast this in a large AoE, you get again 60 seconds. AoE now of the strong condition, so that's +5 might. Very nice. Strong on your whole party's not something you're going to say no to. But then on top of that, whenever you kill a target, you're going to heal for a lot of health. It says 80, but again, with power level scaling and the extra scaling that you get from might, because you're just giving the might. This is actually going to be over 100 healing in both cases. And especially in the mid game, you can go from near death to full health just by killing one target. And it just allows you to snowball kills and mob fights to keep targets alive. Again, passive healing is the kind of healing that you want. Devotions of the Faithful increases your accuracy, which is awesome, and decreases enemy accuracy. This +20 swing in accuracy is really strong. Then there's some reactive buffs that Cleric gets, especially at low levels, that are awesome. Suppress Affliction. This is just like the Paladin Suppress Affliction. If you get a target that's charmed, you cast this on them, and for the duration, that charm is gone. And you can increase that duration with Salvation of Time if you wanted, right? They also get Withdraw. I treat withdraws as like preemptive resurrections, right? I'm casting this on a target when I know they're going to die, and it just keeps them from actually getting those debuffs. So it's not bringing them in the fight, they're actually getting out of the fight, but I find this better than letting the target die and resurrecting them, just from the long-term strategical part of the game, because you don't want to accumulate those debuffs that only leave on rest. Oh, and then finally, I can't believe I forgot, Dire Blessing, one of the best buffs. I love this buff. You get it early. It does Aware 30 seconds base on your entire party. That's +5 perception and +50 grazes to hit. 50% grazes to hit is very easy to overlook, but just trust me, it's going to do so much for your damage, for the duration of your spells, for just the reliability of your actions in general. Just open the fight by casting Dire Blessing. I usually start by casting Acute on myself, or maybe a different caster, then cast Dire Blessing on everyone, and then Triumph of the Crusaders on everyone, and then you just go to town using your offensive spells, which we can turn to now. There are some amazing offensive spells that this class gets. Cleansing Flame, for example. Very high damage burn over time on a target. It's kind of, I think of it as like a lesser version of Disintegration, but still very good single target damage. Shining Beacon. I often don't cast this because when you're casting Triumph of the Crusaders and Devotions of the Faithful, you don't have the spell slots for it. But if you're willing to use Brilliant, Shining Beacon is a decent burn damage over the time, also lowers enemy defenses, which is good, and importantly, it targets Will. And Will is one of the most reliable defenses for you to target, and there aren't many ways to deal damage against Will. This is one of them, so yeah, that's definitely something to factor in. And then there are your god-specific symbols. So I have the Bareth subclass. You can see this is going to summon a symbol on the ground, which will every 6 seconds deal 35 to 50 corrode damage against mobs. That adds up to a lot of damage, and other classes have their own equivalents. Yeah, and yeah, that's basically the base cleric. It's a decent damage caster when you get the late levels, but for the entire game, an amazing support caster. Now let's talk about priest subclasses. These are very important. Your subclass for priest is whichever god you serve, which is going to do a lot of things. And some of these add some very, very interesting spells to the cleric sublist. I wish I could talk about all of them. I really can't right now. One of my favorites is actually one that's not on here, which is the Rimmergrand subclass. And that is one that's unique to one of the sidekicks you can get to the game. But what's really interesting about it is it adds a lot of cold damage, high AoE damage spells that deal cold damage to the cleric spell list. And that really makes a cleric a good offensive caster, because one of the problems that clerics have is they have good offensive spells, but it's all fire damage. And you need varied damage in this game. You just do. So getting cold damage is kind of the perfect secondary damage type, because targets that are immune to fire are unlikely to be immune to cold and vice versa. So, but there's others as well. Skane is a very popular one. I haven't messed around with this a lot, but it adds a lot of defensive and offensive rogue abilities to the cleric base class. Shadowing Beyond in particular is a very exploitable one. It'll also give you Finishing Blow for boss killing, single target weapon striking damage. Wail is another very popular one. It adds a bunch of illusion magic from the wizard tree to your character, and some of these illusion spells that it adds are really good defensively, like plus 50 to your deflection there. Mirrored Image as a plus 30. I mean, it just makes your cleric much more durable, which is good on its own, but you can combine this with certain defensive stacking classes as well, so Wail, very popular. One of my favorites is Woodica. I'm not saying it's the best, but it's really, really fun. Woodicas get these interesting writs, which make enemies unable to do certain things. And by high levels, it's stuff like cannot use spells at all. You can imagine against spellcasting bosses how this completely shuts them down. However, the main reasons I pick Woodica is for their spiritual weapon. All clerics get spiritual weapons, and it's going to summon a weapon that varies depending on which god you serve. And all of those weapons are going to have a damaging lash, which depends on which god you serve. The lash will scale with your particular reputation bonuses. Most spiritual weapons don't end up being that good, because clerics don't really make a good weapon class. However, with Woodica, your spiritual weapon actually summons monk fists, just like transcendent suffering monks, that will deal raw damage as your lash, which is easily the best lash. It starts at 20, but again, it's going to scale. It's going to scale a lot. You can get into the 30s, and I think you might even be able to get into the 40s with the right power level and single class. But I've already talked about how good monk fists are, one of the best weapons in the game. A monk fist with an added lash on top of it, both scaling ridiculously with power level. On a power level build that's like Death Godlike or whatever, this is probably the best DPS weapon in the entire game. And you get it as a summon weapon on a cleric, which is very interesting. I love making builds around this. I probably will release a build for this. I might have already released it depending on how long it takes to finish this video, or I might be releasing it soon after. So it's kind of a Wolverine build. Yeah, keep an eye open for that, or watch it if it's already out. I'll have it linked in the description. So anyways, that is Priest. Returning to our tier list now. Next up on our list is Ranger. Ranger is going into niche tier. And I have kind of been persuaded that it's probably the worst class in the game, even though I like it a lot, and its niche is actually quite valuable. Let's take a look at Ranger. So the big thing that Rangers get is an animal companion, which is a little bit like a summon, right? And then you get a lot of boosts by fighting in tandem with that animal companion. And mostly what you're boosting with this class is your accuracy. You get tons of sources of accuracy. So for example, Stalker's Link, you get plus 10 accuracy when you're attacking the same target as your animal companion. So it's a single target accuracy boost, but plus 10 in the passive tree, meaning it stacks with everything else. Very good. Survival of the Fittest is another plus 10 to below 50% health targets. Again, stacking with everything else. This is incredible, especially in boss fights where below 50% ends up being a lot of time. This really stacks up. Marksman will give you plus 5 to your ranged weapon attacks, so that's 25 with ranged weapons in total. And then of course you get some active buffs to your accuracy as well. For example, Marked Prey. This will give you plus 10 against marked targets, but there's a weird way about how it's coded, where this actually ends up stacking with unconditional accuracy boosts, even though it's in the active tree. I mean, the gist is that it fits in the accuracy against marked target slot, and it's the only source of that. So it effectively stacks with everything. With Marked Prey, that stacks. Stalker's Link, that stacks.
Survival of the Fittest, that stacks. That's plus 30 stackable accuracy on a single target. And then if you get accuracy anywhere else, like you can get plus 20 against certain types with Hunter's Claw, or whatever you combine this class with, if they have accuracy boosts in their kit, it can add up to plus 50 to 60 accuracy you can get on this class on a single target. Now, is there another class you could pair this with that really wants accuracy against a single target? And I mean, yeah, the big one is definitely Cipher, right? We talked about Cipher. So Cipher can get another plus 20 accuracy from Borrowed Instinct. And now they're throwing out Disintegrations at plus 50 or more accuracy. They're very reliably hitting them. And remember, if you're hitting Disintegration or critting with it, because it's raw damage, that's all you really need. But also if you wanted to do your charms as well, you're hitting those very, very reliably. You get the idea. It just makes you unstoppable in the damage and CC department. I think Cipher Rangers, that's the Seer class, actually are very, very strong. But also Monk Rangers are quite good, because monks want to get lots of crits to stack Swift Flurry and Heartbeat Drumming, which we've already talked about. Accuracy means more crits. They also have their own sources of accuracy as well, like for example Enduring Dance. So you can do this thing where you can go Enduring Dance, stand back with a melee weapon on Instruments of Pain, and all of the boosted damage, all of the boosted accuracy from the Ranger tree, and suddenly you're just dealing insane amounts. So besides just stacking accuracy, Rangers do have some cool things. They have Driving Flight. This will make your ranged attacks bounce, which is a kind of action economy hack, right? Because each time you attack, you're technically attacking twice. And it's one of the better action economy hacks just in terms of raw damage. However, it's damage that's naturally spread out, so, you can make the judgments. But, I mean, don't sleep on Driving Flight. It's quite good. They also get Concussive Tranquilizer. This is one of the better ways to cleanse enemy beneficial effects, which can be very, very important. There are some enemies and bosses in this game which stack up so many buffs on themselves, they're basically unkillable. So until you can cleanse them, they'll never die. If you go single class, they eventually get Heartseeker, which is a great source of Enfeebled. A 20 base from Enfeebled is actually 30 once it's buffed by Enfeebled, and then it scales even more with Intelligence, right? Finally, a very interesting idea, which is hard to execute on, is Takedown Combo. When you're working in tandem with your animal companion, what happens is the animal companion will knock a target prone, and then the next attack against that target is going to get a plus 100% increase to damage. But there's actually a little hack you can do where if you apply a damage over time effect, knock them prone, and then never attack them, for the 10 seconds that they have this buff waiting for it to trigger, it will actually increase the damage over time effect you have on them. And so the obvious synergy with this is Disintegration. You cast Disintegration, you're now doubling the damage of Disintegration while they have the Takedown Combo, and you never actually have to expend it. Yeah, that's in theory really good. The problem is I find that it's hard to get your animal companion to reliably hit. So if you want to do this often, maybe find other members of your party that can boost its accuracy. In terms of subclasses, to be honest, the subclasses for Ranger are pretty mediocre in my opinion. Stalker is probably the best. Whenever you are standing close to your animal companion, you will both get a +1 to your armor rating and a +5 to your deflection. And that's honestly pretty good. However, if the animal companion leaves your radius, you will suffer from Bonded Grief, which is really debilitating. So you have to keep your animal companion glued to you, which is a pretty serious drawback. Sharpshooter can be interesting. Again, it has some drawbacks I don't find worth. A lot of people like Ghost Heart. It makes you immune to Bonded Grief, but you actually end up having to summon your companion because it's like the ghost of your companion. Actually, yeah, that is pretty good, but for some reason I just don't like the idea of a ghost companion. I don't know, that's up to you. Arcane Archer, you can do some very cheesy things, but it's just really, really broken. They did not implement this well. There are tons of problems with the math that are not fixed unless you download the unofficial community patch. So since I do not play with mods or patches very much, I tend not to play Arcane Archer. You can experiment with it on your own time. Okay, back to the tier list now. We got 2 classes left to cover. The next is Rogue. Rogue is going to go into bread and butter tier. I'll probably place it here. Let's look at Rogue now. Rogue is another one of my favorite classes in this game. It's powerful, and it's just so fun. It does what you want rogues to do, which I'm sure fundamentally is about being a high damage skirmishing striker class, and rogues definitely deliver on that. Their first major ability is Sneak Attack. This is a scaling flat bonus to your damage on attacks against anyone who is flanked or has an affliction. It's very easy to get. By late game, you can double it with Death Blows. Actually, it's not quite double when you factor in all the scaling or whatever. It doesn't matter. It just adds another 50%, and that's quite good. But you only get that extra 50% when they have 2 or more conditions which will proc Sneak Attack. Still, that's very easy to get, so you can really reliably get this on pretty much every attack. For the skirmishing, hard to kill part, they have the escape line. Escape is really good for just repositioning. It also gives you a short duration boost to your deflection, which makes you hard to kill. So again, very good for avoiding attacks. There are 2 lines you can go with this. There's the Shadow Step line, which will make your attack paralyze after, and then Hobble after. So this is the more offensive-oriented one. The one I prefer to do is the Shadowing Beyond route. This increases the duration and makes you invisible, eventually making you invisible for quite a while and giving you the Swift condition, which is quite good. Invisibility is great to combine with Backstab, which will give you more damage when you're hiding and you're making a melee attack. So yeah, you can just jump around going invisible, backstabbing people for tons of damage, getting all of this damage, all of the sneak attack damage, and if you pick the assassin subclass, it goes even more as well, which is why the Soul Blade rogue combo is so powerful in this game. And then finally, if you go single class rogue, you get this straight up full attack, 3 guile, bonus damage, and it also makes you invisible and untargetable after making it. And there's some really cheesy stuff you can do with this. I'm not going to get into it now, though. So that's the skirmishing angle of the assassin. Oh, I forgot to add, finishing blow will deal more damage based on the enemy's missing health, so it makes you very good at finishing targets, right? So very good at single target killing and kind of skirmishing and jumping around the encounter. However, that's not all rogues are good at this game, and you may be surprised to hear that rogues also make pretty good tanks. They have their own kind of tank line, and it's the tank line that I actually really like about them most. So the first thing that rogues get for tanking is riposte. Whenever a target misses them, I think there's a 20% chance that you will riposte, which is an action economy free attack made against a target that missed you. This allows you to weaponize your defensive, and it kind of creates the inverse of like lifesteal effects, where with lifesteal effects you get durability the more damage you build. With riposte, you get damage the more durability you build. And so combining this with Paladin or Wizard or any class which gets lots of defensive bonuses, you can start getting lots of ripostes. Yeah, definitely a Steel Garrote rogue to build around riposte. Very, very strong. I recommend you try that. On top of that, they will also get this ability, Persistent Distraction, which I consider one of the best passives in the entire game. I don't know why more people don't talk about how overloaded this is for just a single passive ability you get at like tier 5. But what this does is it gives you +1 to your engagement limit, which can be quite good. There are entire builds around stacking engagement, like what we talked about with the fighter. And it also makes it so every enemy that you engage is distracted. The distracted condition not only procs your sneak attack, giving you a source of sneak attack or another source to add to death blows, but it also makes that target have a -5 to their perception. That's a -5 to their accuracy, makes them more likely to miss, makes you more likely to riposte, and most importantly, that target will count as flanked, right? So if they are both flanked and distracted, congratulations, you've now procced death blows, because that's 2 conditions that work with sneak attack, right? So all you have to do is engage an enemy with persistent distraction, and you've got that death blows going for you. Also, just think about for a minute how much this is debuffing. It's a -5 to their perception, which is a -5 to their accuracy. It's a -10 to their reflex defense. It also, they count as flanked, which is a -10 to their deflection defense. And a flanked target also has a -1 to their armor rating. And you're doing this to every enemy you engage. If you build up your engagement enough, you can spread this to tons and tons of targets, debuffing them a lot. And it all happens action economy free. I mean, you just automatically engage them instantly. Anyways, I think that basically covers the rogue class. So moving on now to the rogue subclasses, all of these are good, and that is so cool. Such a well-designed class. All of these are good and interesting, and they make the rogue different. Now, I have to talk about 3 of them. I'm going to leave out Debonair. You should look at that at your own time because it's very interesting. But first, let's just touch on Assassin. Assassin get this Assassinate ability where they're always taking a little bit more damage, but they're getting massive bonuses to the accuracy, penetration, and critical hit damage whenever they are attacking from stealth or invisibility. I can't remember what it all is. I believe it's plus 20 to your accuracy and plus 4 to your penetration. I can't remember the critical hit damage. It might be like 25% or something. Anyways, this makes your stealth attack slap for an absurd amount of damage. Again, stacking so well with backstab, with death blows, and with the soul blade ability. That's how you can end up getting like 700 plus damage on a soul strike. Amazing. Street Fighter has to get talked about. Street Fighters are so weird and interesting. Whenever they're bloodied, they get this heating up effect. Whenever they're heating up, their recovery on attacks is reduced by 50%. And whenever you factor in inversion math, it's actually even more than that. And you start attacking at like light speed. It's one of the fastest attack rates in the game, just as soon as you get either bloodied or flanked. Then if you're both bloodied and flanked, you get all of that attack speed, and you gain a ton of weapon crit damage. I think it's like 100% damage on your crit or something absurd like that. So yeah, you just become probably the single best bonus to weapon striking in the entire game, as long as you're both flanked and bloodied. Now, how can you be both flanked and bloodied? You don't want that to happen, right? You'll die if you're in that situation. Well, of course you won't if, let's say, you have Barring Death's Door on you, right? So you just Barring Death's Door stack on the Street Fighter, throw him into a mob, and just go to town killing everyone. You can also do lifesteal tanking off of this, but if you end up out-tanking, out-healing their damage by too much, you stop being bloodied, and you lose the extra weapon crit. So yeah, I prefer to just go straight, full damage glass cannon, usually on either a godlike or a human, that get bonuses when you're low health, cast Barring Death's Door, and just go to town on a mob, killing everybody. So that is the Street Fighter. Yeah, one of the best weapon striker kits in the game. And then finally, there's the Trickster. We got to talk about them. They gain a lot of illusion spells, which they can cast using Guile. And some of these illusion spells, like Mirror Image, end up giving you big increases to your deflection. And now what can you use that for? Proccing riposts, right? So if you go Trickster plus Paladin, that's kind of the gold standard for riposte builds. Very, very strong. However, I also use Trickster on my fighters, swashbucklers, because you'll get Rimmergren's Repulsive Visage, which is a source of Terrified. It's Terrified in an aura around yourself, and it pulses. Very strong. And so, yeah, this is a great way to get Terrified on your frontline fighters. You can either get it this way or through the Barbarian, which we've already talked about. The drawback is that your sneak attack damage isn't as high for the Trickster, but it's 100% worth it. All right, last class of the game now is Wizard, and Wizard is going in overloaded tier. Wizards are so strong in this game, probably in the top 5 best classes of the game. Let's look at them. It honestly would have been nice to cover Wizard first, because they really are the linchpin of several amazing strategies. So the first strategy is what I call will attacking, because a level 2 spell that wizards get is this, Miasma of Dull-Mindedness. When you hit this on a target for the next 20 seconds, and of course that scales, they will have a minus 10 to their perception, a minus 10 to their intellect, and a minus 10 to their resolve. And when you realize what all of this gives you, it really, really adds up. So a minus 10 to their perception, that's a minus 10 to their accuracy, that's a minus 20 to their reflex defense. A minus 10 to their intellect. That is a significant debuff to the duration of their self buffs, to the AoE of their spells and abilities, but most importantly, it's a minus 20 to their will defense. Likewise, Resolve is a minus 20 to their will defense, so you stack these together, and hitting this on a target is a minus 40 to their will defense. And that's why attacking will is so valuable, because you can debuff will more than any other defense in the game. Oh, and by the way, a -10 to the resolve is also reducing their reduction of hostile effects, right? So effectively increasing the duration of hostile effects in the same way that, say, enfeebled increases the duration of hostile effects. So you hit this, you hit an enfeebled, and suddenly you're getting, I think, 80% increased duration on your spell effects. Yeah, like, that's a lot. Miasma Dull-Mindedness probably should be a higher spell level ability. It's so good. And it's not even single target. This is AoE, by the way, guys. So, yeah, linchpin of one of the core offensive strategies, which is attacking the will defense. You debuff their will defense, and you attack it, and you can do it in several ways, usually with ciphers and priests. But, of course, also with wizards, because you hit them with a Dull-Mindedness, and then you hit them with Rimmergrand's Innervating Terror. It targets will, and now they're terrified for forever, and you're proccing all of those disengagement attacks. Amazing. So that is one of the linchpin abilities. They also have spells, which are the linchpin for all defensive stacking strategies. So, for example, Arcane Veil gives you a limited plus 50 to deflection, but it adds up because this, obviously, that 12-second scales, and then you can increase it with Salvation of Time to basically have plus 50 deflection up for as long as you need it. They have a very interesting Wizard's Double, which will give you plus 40 for as long as you're not hit, but if you can make sure that you're never hit, it adds up. Ledengrass Safeguard gives you plus 20 to all your defenses, plus 5 to your armor rating, plus 5 to all armor. Insanely good defensive buff. So then they also have Arcane Reflection. You can make yourself absolutely impenetrable with this class. And then they have their summon direction. Summons for wizards are very, very interesting because they have a line of summons called Essential Phantom and then later Substantial Phantom. I actually prefer Essential Phantom myself. But what these do is create a summon which is a duplicate of your caster. And what's important about it is it duplicates all of your items. So if you find any items of the game which has very powerful proccing effects, when you take damage, or whenever you drop below half health, or anything like that, you'll find lots of items like this. You can put them on your wizard, summon an Essential Phantom, and you effectively get a whole nother proc per encounter with those items. But you can also use this with your amazing summoned weapons. So for example, a single class fighter gets Cadebald's Black Bow. This Black Bow, it's just a decent summoned bow, which is going to deal corrode damage. It's always going to jump targets, and then has this effect where enemies, if they fail, I believe, a will save, will become terrified. And remember, it's hitting an initial target plus 1 on the jump. So every attack, you can terrify potentially 2 targets. And then, if you summon the Black Bow first, and then summon Essential Phantom, that Phantom's also going to have the Black Bow, and he's going to be proccing Terrify on targets. The CC is incredible, the targets running away from you is incredible, and that's just one angle. There's tons of cool weapons in the game, which you can experiment with Essential Phantom on. Substantial Phantom is the same as Essential Phantom, except they will also cast spells. But personally, I don't want my Phantoms to cast spells. I just want them to attack with Cadebald's Black Bow, usually. So that summon angle, very cool for wizards. What about cleansing? Wizards have some of the best buff cleansing powers in the game, usually through this Arcane Cleanse, minus 1,000 seconds of duration of beneficial effects. I mean, yeah, there isn't an enemy in the game which will ever have that much duration. So basically, it takes every beneficial effect they have on themselves and eliminates them from the game. Now they're completely naked of buffs and you can just hammer on them. Especially wizards, when you're fighting enemy wizards which have all of the defensive buffs that we've talked about, when you nail them with an Arcane Cleanse, it is over for them and they just die. What about increasing buffs on yourself? Wizards get this ability, Wall of Draining, where if you put it on an enemy, it will take a second from their beneficial effects and add it to you, so it just drains away their effects and increases the duration of yours. And there's ways with items in this game where you can do this practically permanently. And yeah, so you can create for yourself, this is like Salvation of Time, but just even better. And there's so many great personal buffs that the wizards already get and stuff you can get through items that, yeah, this becomes a borderline game-breaking ability. For crowd control effects, we already talked about one of the best sources of Terrify here, and then again with Cadebald's Black Bow. They have other ones as well. Arduous Delay of Motion reduces enemy action speed, and I believe this benefits from inversion math, so that's even higher than negative 33%. That really adds up. And again, it targets will defense, which you know the gist. Early game Chill Fog is a very good source of blinded, very powerful, and it's actually good for manipulating enemies to like group them up. Gaze of the Adragon is a small radius source of petrified, which is very difficult to resist. Some of the best controllers in the game, we've talked about their summon strategies, we've talked about their debuff strategy through targeting will defense, we talked about their personal defensive buffs. Their summon weapons are amazing, even if you want to go summon casters. And then finally, they just deal so much damage with their spells. They have tons of amazing spells. I mean, Minoleta's Missile Silo, I mean, this just devastates enemies, especially if you stack up enough power level. It scales really well with power level. Wilting Wind does raw damage and weakens targets in an AoE. Very powerful. Ninigauth's Freezing Pillar, personally I love this one. The damage ends up scaling a lot. It triggers every 3 seconds, so it will just melt people in its AoE, and it has actually a very big AoE. I will often take Secrets of Rhyme for bonus penetration on frost and water attacks, which will work for Ninigauth's Freezing Pillar and also for Chill Fog, and that handles a lot of my damage in the early game. You can just start drawing Venn diagrams with Chill Frog, Ninigauth's Pillar, and just devastate enemies that way. And I mean, there's tons of other options as well. A Freezing Rake, another frost ability, tons of good burst damage. I mean, the ways that wizards can deal damage with their spells in this game are, there's just a ton of them. So, Kensel's Corrosive Skin, that one can be really, really fun. Honestly, most of the spells that wizards get access to are just good. So, yeah, I mean, I could harp on about this class forever. It makes both a good multi-class and a good single class. Am I missing anything? I don't think so. I've talked about a lot. I just can't talk about them all. They're just so good. I don't know what else to say. Let's go to their subclasses. Wizards have tons of subclasses, but also just one subclass. They have tons technically because they have all of these specialist wizards, which kind of are a throwback to the original Baldur's Gate games. And there's some interesting things you can do with these, especially Evoker. Basically what they do is increase your power level a lot with your particular spell types, and it'll give you an interesting special ability, but the drawback is that you lose 2 schools of magic, and that's a pretty serious drawback. But I know Evoker can be quite good if you just go all in on power level scaling on your damaging spells. I mean, it's honestly, it's straightforward, but quite potent. But the reason I say wizards only have one subclass is because Blood Mage, as a subclass they added late after release of the game, is so good that you pretty much always want to pick it. Blood Mages get this Blood Sacrifice ability, which it will deal a random amount of raw damage, which goes in certain tiers. You deal that to yourself, and then you will get a buff, which gives you +1 to your wizard power levels, which is amazing. And then it will also return a level of a wizard spell resource. With enough healing and time, you can Blood Sacrifice to return all of your spell slots. And yeah, especially early in mid-game, that becomes very, very good. You can just start spamming spells like crazy. The big strategy is to go Blood Sacrifice into Kenselhalt's Corrosive Siphon. This is an AoE corrode damage spell, which also heals you for the damage that it deals. So you get the idea. If you go Blood Sacrifice, Kenselhalt's Corrosive Siphon, Blood Sacrifice again, you then get the spell back. You've healed up all the damage you took from Blood Sacrifice, and you can just start spamming spells. And yeah, a very, very good strategy in the early game. You also lose -15 to all of your defenses, which is a bummer, but it doesn't super matter in the end. If you just go full lifesteal tank Blood Mage, you can just spam spells the entire game, and that is so powerful. It really warps how good the wizard is, in my opinion. And that is it. This is my final rankings. I'm not super happy with this distribution. I would love it if maybe we could do something like this. But there's a kind of problem where, in my opinion, there is a gulf between Fighter Wizard and Monk Chanter. So, like, if you moved... I mean, Monk really does belong in Overloaded tier. Like, I feel pretty strongly about that. It's definition of an Overloaded class. But it's not... It doesn't offer as many game-breaking things as Fighter and Wizard. Like, Fighter and Wizard can really break the game open in a way that Monk can't. I don't know. That's not even necessarily true. I guess Monk should be an Overloaded. I take all of that back, what I just said. You can't take Monk out of Overloaded. I think Chanter is flexible. Chanter is flexible for me. You can test them and decide for yourselves. But yeah, here's my finished list. I'm happy with this as a low resolution tier list, like I said.
All right. So that is it for the list proper, but please keep watching or listening because now I'm going to discuss the rankings I just gave with one of the top experts on this game, Thelee. Just so you know, there is not going to be much happening on the screen from this point out. It's pretty much going to be a podcast style, so I'll understand if you don't watch and you just want to listen. All right, so we're joined now by a very special guest who's going to discuss my Deadfire class tier list with me. Some of you might recognize his name if you are a regular on the Obsidian Pillars of Eternity forums. It is Thelee. Thelee is, well, I'll get into a more detailed introduction of his qualifications in a second, but just in general, he is a content author on the Obsidian Deadfire forums. Thelee, thank you so much for taking the time and welcome.
You're welcome. Pleasure to be here. So I go by Thelee on the internet. I do a lot of content on the Obsidian forums. I also wrote the Almanac of Deadfire on Game FAQs, which is not bragging, but just probably pretty definitive on a lot of topics about Deadfire.
I would definitely say so. I think it's the definitive guide on Deadfire. I link it all the time, and I believe I've referenced it at least twice in this video. So
yeah, great. And also in terms of qualifications, I also did the Ultimate Challenge. I was the fourth person to beat that and get that verified by Obsidian. So I feel like that gives me some creds to, lend some opinions or thoughts about Deadfire.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely much more credibility than I have in Deadfire. So for listeners who don't know, the Ultimate Challenge is a very difficult challenge mode in Pillars of Eternity Deadfire. And in the 6 years since the game's release, I believe only 14 people have recorded a verified completed run. Is that right? It's 14, right?
Yeah, that sounds about right. It's a pretty brutal challenge. It's like solo, all the special challenges enabled, and you have to kill all these specific bosses, so there's no getting around it, and you have to record the entire thing to verify that you don't cheat or do anything really sketchy, so it's a pretty brutal thing to do.
Yeah, it is savage. I've definitely put in a dozen or so hours trying my own. The real challenge for me is the patience. You have to be so focused for such a long period of time. And I find on any kind of these kind of challenges where you slip up and you have to restart, I get lulled into a false sense of security. You're clearing encounters and you think nothing can kill you, and then you make a mistake and that's the end of your run.
Yeah, it's definitely like that. The character that I ended up completing it was the 28th. So there were 27 failed attempts, and actually I had a few really scary moments near the end of the 28th run. So it really is just a test of patience, and you just really got to do it for the love of it, pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely. So, anyone who completes the Ultimate Run has mad credibility as far as I'm concerned, but being the fourth to complete it and getting your name on that plaque at the Obsidian headquarters, that is extremely cool.
Yeah, someday I'll take a trip down to Orange County and go to the offices and get a picture with it.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Well, my thought, if we go ahead and dive into the discussion, I thought it might be easiest to just go by tier. We can start with game-breaking tier and kind of work our way down, and you can tell me any of your thoughts or disagreements with the classes I've ranked in that tier. Does that sound good to you?
Sure.
Okay, great. So starting off then with game-breaking tier, I put the Cipher and the Priest in this tier, and I put them in that order. Did I get anything wrong there?
I completely agree with you. When I really want to cheese a mega boss, or I just want to do a mega boss with a random party, and I need to make it work, then I add in a Cipher or a Priest. Probably both sometimes. I think you nailed it. I was watching through it, and yeah, it really comes down to both the Cipher having that built-in way to regenerate resources, not just for one character, but potentially your entire party. Mm-hmm. And then the Priest with Salvation of Time. Individually, those are game-breaking on their own. And, if you get a party with both of them, then, pretty much you trivialize content if you're just patient enough to use that cheese over and over again. So, yeah, there's really no discussion there. I agree. They're game-breaking. Honestly, a little bit of, ultimate history, I think most of the early attempts involved a Priest because of that Salvation of Time and then Barring Death's Door interaction.
Right.
these two classes really just bend the game and warp it around themselves.
Great. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad I got at least that right. And yeah, it really is game breaking in my opinion, because for me, game breaking has a really specific definition, and that is any kind of bug or combo which is so powerful that you no longer have to interact with the actual tactics of the game. And yeah, Cipher and Priest really just do that. And it's why I kind of feel awkward. Like, I need them in their own tier, because, like, I don't really use that cheese because it's not fun, you know? But unlike a lot of the other cheesy ultimate strats in the game, this one is clearly not a bug. Like, it was intended by them. And so my personal way to get around it is I only allow a Barring Death's Door spell to be cast on one party member. And I kind of leave it at that.
Adding to that, it's a little bit unfortunate because I feel like Salvation of Time is such an interesting spell, especially in Deadfire. And it just, a lot of the interactions just get kind of crowded out by both like the Brilliant interaction and then also Barring Death's Door. So similarly, when I play a Priest and I pick up Salvation of Time, I just kind of make a rule for myself. Okay, Barring Death's Door, Brilliant, they exist, but unless I'm like really struggling with a Mega Boss, I'm just not going to touch them, because it just kind of like, you basically get to opt out, like you say. You basically get to opt out of all the mechanics of the game if you start doing that. And to your point, like, it's not a bug. The fact that the Brilliant on the Cipher is at tier 7 means it's both accessible to multi-class and single-class. So that had to have been like a conscious design choice by the developers. So like, they want you to have it there. So it's just like this tempting I win button that you can have.
All right, so that's game breaking tier. I think probably the tier where we'll have the most disagreement is overloaded tier. So I put in this tier Fighter, Wizard, Monk, and Chanter in that order. Although I'm very flexible on the order for this one.
Sure.
So, and I know when we were writing back and forth on the forums, the Fighter is really our main area of disagreement. So I don't know if you want to start there.
Sure, I'll start there. So I'll come right on and say that I generally disagree with where you place the Fighter on the tier list. When Obsidian made like patch 4.0, which introduced a lot of these extra subclasses, including the Tactician for the Fighter, I feel like they're really kind of like shooting for the moon in terms of design. And you get kind of some kind of oddball, fun effects like the Scion for the Cipher, or like the Fury Shaper, or like the Debonair. I think those are all fun, really creative. And then you get the Tactician, which I don't think they would have really gone out with if they had a lot of time to bake, because it is so different from the other fighters, and it's just such a different experience. So it's almost like that I can't even consider like a Tactician like a fighter. It's like a whole completely other class that just happens to share a lot of abilities with a fighter. And it's kind of in the class design, because as context, you get a special buff as long as your entire party is not flanked. I mean, it basically encourages you to warp your entire party around this class, because it's such a powerful buff. And it's such a powerful buff, they knew they had to like have a huge like downside to actually balance it out. But even then, it's pretty easy to deal with the downside. Mm-hmm. So while I could agree with you in like a general sense, like on average, if you somehow average it out, the fighter averages out to be overloaded. But to me, that really means like the Tactician is game breaking, and then all the other fighter subclasses are, I guess, like bread and butter.
Yeah, bread and butter is the tier below. So that's where you would put the fighter. If, say, we just abstracted out the Tactician from the fighter class, you would put fighter in bread and butter tier?
Yeah. And I mean, it's nothing against the fighter. I think, for the most part, I agree with a lot of your assessment. It's just such a solid class. And I think it's really well designed, because it's like so open-ended in terms of design. It's really fun to multi-class with it. And like the other subclasses, you can just find really fun interactions with other classes in the game. It's just not busted in a way that I put it into the overloaded tier. It just makes a lot of things a lot easier to have a fighter mixed in, either single class or multi-class. But then, yeah, I just have to shove Tactician away. I understand desire to be kind of consistent, treat all the classes equally, but I think they just kind of like overshot with the Tactician design, that it's kind of like radioactive in terms of how game breaking it is.
Sure, yeah. You know, we discussed this, on the forums. I feel very strongly that you really ought to just consider Tactician as part of the fighter class. But for the sake of this discussion, I think we can put aside the Tactician, because I will say, like, I haven't played that many Tacticians. I think I did one completed Tactician run. I saw why it was so powerful. But one of the ways I like to play the fighter
is actually, it's a very effective unit on a very low attention economy. And that is one way I like to think about real-time with pause games, is that they have an attention economy the same way we might think about an action economy. And some players are going to have more attention to give to the game, like highly skilled players, let's say, and some are going to have less. But everyone has some kind of limit, like fully micromanaging perfectly every class in your party is probably a pipe dream, especially if you have a lot of complex units in your party. So one of the reasons I really value the fighter is you can very easily program, like as soon as Unbending goes down, refresh. As soon as Discipline Strikes goes down, refresh. Then you just throw him into the middle of a encounter, and you can spend the rest of your time focusing on your casters, and he's still going to output decent damage, and you don't even have to look at his health bar. He'll never be even close to dying.
You know,
and Tactician changes all
really
that, so that's a big reason why I actually prefer not to play Tactician, even though I recognize it's better.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I love that, actually, the idea of an attention economy, because that is completely right. In fact, I have like a pretty standard script, a fighter script, that I just mix into all my fighters or fighter multi-classes, which is like, get uptime on Discipline Barrage, use Knockdown every once in a while, and trigger Unbending. And it's such a solid core that, yeah, you're right. It makes Path of Damned and other stuff that's so much easier just having a character that I don't really have to worry about, because just the autopilot is pretty good on its own. And actually, this is something I wanted to mention, because I don't remember it being mentioned in your tier list, is something that contributes to these discussion is that the classes do have different starting health, but also defenses, and I think that contributes to discussion. So Fighter also starts with a higher deflection than everyone else.
Yes.
So by default, they're just a really tanky class and they also have their built-in passive where they regenerate health. So regardless of what you're doing, they're going to survive easier and just outlast everyone else. I still probably wouldn't push it up to overloaded, but you are right that you just get a lot just from not having to really pay attention to it. Because, casters require a lot of micromanagement. Fighters are effortless. They're just really effortlessly good. I just happen to think there's like a ceiling to that.
Sure. So let's talk about Unbending then, because if we factor out Tactician, that's the major thing that I really want to put an overloaded tier for, because Unbending, to me, it has all the hallmarks of being a game-breaking mechanic, in that it actually bypasses most of the tactics of the game. So, like, if you compare a fighter to a paladin, I mean, I said this in the video, I love paladins, and fighter being so good was kind of a black pill for me, because I spent so many hours making very tanky characters by doing, you start by stacking armor, and then you realize, when enemies crit you, they're getting, half again their penetration on crits. So it's not enough to just fully stack armor to be safe. You also need to stack defenses. And then you're also going to want some healing in there. And there's this layered approach to building a defensive character. And all of those layers have drawbacks where you're trading offense to get the defense. And then there's the fighter, and you can just click Unbending, and he will tank better than the best tanky paladin you can have in your party. And you actually just get all of that for building intelligence, which you'd want anyways. And you can just slam everything into utility or into damage statistics, and they're still the tankiest class in the game, just from one button. So am I missing anything with that, or do you just not value that as highly?
I put it in like a similar category to some of the wizard spells. Unbending is extremely annoying when an enemy uses it, especially there's some fights in Survivor Secret Slayer DLC where there's like some high-level fighters who use Unbending, and if you're not careful, they will literally become immortal while they have Unbending up, and it's super annoying. But the reason why I put in this similar category is that when it's on an enemy, it's really good because you, as a player, have to kill all the enemies in order to progress. Whereas if it's on you and you have like a party, you're not playing solo, if the enemies aren't attacking you, then it's not great. It's not nearly as great. Fighter has an easier time than a wizard, because the wizard has some like really killer high-level defense spells, but like wizard is generally not going to be running into the thick of combat, especially because the best ones are single class only, so you're not really building a multi-class like spellblade type. So fighter has a little bit of an easier time, but it's not quite at the level of overloaded for me, because if like you get hit with like some powerful nukes, whether party wide or something goes wrong with your engagement, and they just bypass your fighter, or they're like ranged rogues around, then the unbending is kind of dead. I'm not to say that unbending isn't good when it really works, but it's just a little bit too defensive, like overwhelmingly defensive, with not that it is a little bit missing in terms of like general use that would push it out of bread and butter for me.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's interesting. That's obviously very well thought out perspective because you're quite right. There is an asymmetry between you and your enemies where you have to kill all of them, otherwise you just don't progress. But I mean, practically speaking, that really hasn't been my experience. I find that it is not difficult to get my fighter in a situation where most everyone is attacking them. Yeah, I mean, and that's usually how I play the fighter, is I just kind of throw them into a mob. And I always stack a lot of engagement, because, I mean, that's another thing. I think engagement stacking on fighters is so efficient, and it's already kind of an elite strategy in Deadfire. Like, engagement offers you so much in terms of battlefield control. Fighters just get a ton of attack speed for stacking it. And then you also get a lot of offense for it, because more engagement means more disengagement attacks, which is already one of the more uncounterable damage strategies in my mind. Because, the amount of attack bonuses you get from a disengagement attack, and then the fact that hitting Terrify on targets is so easy. With a wizard in your party, I can't think of the spell, because there's two of them, of the Terrify spells, but the tier power level 5 or 6 spell targets will. And like I said in my video, one of the first breakthroughs for me in this game was realizing that anything that targets will is automatically just a step above, because you can debuff will so efficiently. And then the fact that stacking engagement fighters want to wield a club anyways because of Kapana Taga, so then they're debuffing will even more through the modal. It just creates this really perfect loop where everyone in your party is helping everyone else. You don't get that as efficiently without a fighter. First off, because no other class benefits from engagement like they do. And second off, no other class can throw themselves into a mob and be immortal the way they can.
Sure. The kinds of situations that I'm thinking about, though, are like where you have enemy rogues, or rogue types especially. They are like one of the few types of enemies that will either willingly break engagement, or like they use escape and they get out of engagement. Right. And their AI is actually programmed to basically go for squishy characters. Mm-hmm. And in those kinds of situations, unbending on a fighter doesn't really help. Although I guess you could have an entire party like everyone has unbending, so in that situation I guess that would be pretty good.
It's true, although I will say, because fighters can be immortal in a way that the AI doesn't recognize, you will still draw aggro. Because technically what the AI sees in terms of your defenses and your hit points, they think you're actually pretty squishy. Especially if you buff up your backline a fair amount. But because they don't really factor in that you have immortal healing. Like, you can just dump your constitution, for example, and the AI will see, oh, his hit points are so low, I can just kill him. And, they fall for the trap.
That is true. I will, I guess, reserve my rating on that, simply because, like, of AoE effects and stuff like that. Also...
You can't fully tank all damage, for sure. I won't say that.
I mean, okay, so I think you've made a compelling case why I say like a single class fighter could bump up to overloaded. I know you don't want to do that, but if somehow this granular, because they actually have the capacity to actually tank all the damage for your party with that tier 9 ability. I forget what it's called, take the hit or something like that. So, okay, in such a situation, I think that's like actually a compelling case you've made for that. But, for example, I'm starting a run now with like where you have Vila, does the challenge rate to keep Vila alive. And unfortunately, no amount of Constitution or deflection tanking is going to convince the AI to not go for Vila when it does like an engagement breaking attack or something like that. So unbending doesn't help me at all in such a situation.
Okay, fair enough. I think we've discussed the fighter. I don't think we're going to have any disagreement over Wizard, right? Because in my view, Wizard is one of the strongest candidates for bumping up even into game-breaking tier, because, I mean, they just have a mix of everything. Best control, one of the tankiest units in the game, one of the highest damage units of the game, and then the fact that they can keep buffs on themselves while cleansing enemy buffs. Like, to me, that is... what is that spell? Wall of Draining is a borderline game-breaking spell.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. They're really on the cusp. They can do a little bit of everything really well. some stuff like stupidly well. Like if there was somehow a way that you could do a higher level multi-class between wizard and any other class, that'd basically be the OP class because of just like the stuff that's gated behind a single class wizard. And a blood mage is close to game breaking because they can just regenerate spells at will, but it's just a little bit more annoying than brilliant. It has a little bit more cost because it takes away health. It's a little bit more random. I will say though that losing empower on the blood mage does suck a little bit in the very, very late game high levels, but I mean otherwise, yeah, I don't think we're gonna get much disagreement. Yeah, wizard is really pushing the limits of the overloaded tier.
Yeah, so just for people who don't know, the blood mage mechanic isn't a perfect way to return spell slots, especially high level spell slots, which is what you'd want to do with it, right? Like you'd want to cast your level 9 spell and then blood sacrifice and get your level 9 spell slot back. But there's a random element to it where the higher level the spell slot, the less likely it is to actually return it. So you can end up wasting a lot of time. Yeah, that's frustrating. And the drawbacks are pretty severe. I find in a typical full party Paths of the Damned run where I just have like a standard wizard Aloth on my party, in a lot of the fights he doesn't run out of spells. Now you can't do a lot of the really cheesy things where you spam a particular spell by being able to return it with Blood Mage, but yeah, in a standard party, I do think the advantages of a Blood Mage are a little bit more muted than in like a solo run. So
that being said,
go ahead.
I do think the advantages of the Blood Mage are really impactful when you need them the most. Early on, especially on Paladin Damned, is really brutal, and it just so happens low-level spells are pretty easy to regenerate with Blood Sacrifice. So it kind of tapers off, but it just happens to be that it's real nice when it shines.
Okay, the other two classes in this tier are Monk and Chanter. I actually consider Monk to be one of the best designed classes in the history of this genre, like the Monk in Deadfire. The fact that it synergizes so well with every other class, it has so many build possibilities. It also works really well as a single class. I actually do think probably single class Monk is the optimal way to play it. And then finally, the way it fits into the themes of the game. But the borderline game-breaking thing for me for Monk is Resonant Strike. I mean, to be honest, I haven't messed around with it as much in Deadfire, but I remember Resonant Strike in Pillars 1 just being devastating. Yeah. It's even better, I feel like, in Deadfire because you can infinitely tank through healing. You don't have the health endurance split. And so you can just slowly build up stacks and nuke something down. And that kind of uncounterable damage does mostly bypass the offensive tactics of the game.
So it's funny you mentioned Resonant Strike because I would personally probably put Monk on a game-breaking tier. But when it comes to Resonant Strike, it's literally game-breaking because like it's possible to actually crash the game
right?
if you have too many stacks and release it all at once. I actually think it's probably too overtuned. Like I agree with you that it's pretty flexible, but it's overtuned in that respect. And I actually try to avoid playing with the Monk as a result because it just works way too well with pretty much anything. It requires a little bit more work than a Cipher or a Priest to break the game, but essentially monks do have a regenerating resources built in with their wound mechanic, where normally you take damage and you get some wounds, and those powers like some of their abilities. Like if you take like a big picture view, the abilities are like generally tuned enough where that's not a big deal, but when you get down to it, in specific situations, that's actually pretty busted, and especially because some of the subclasses let you bypass having to take damage to do that. Like, so you got 4 subclasses. One of them you can take drugs and you get wounds. Another one you can do damage. You do damage and you get wounds. And then you have the Forbidden Fist where you get rid of a debuff on yourself and you get wounds. But that's easily gameable. And actually, even for the vanilla or the 4th subclass, the monk itself has an ability called Dance with Death that lets you generate wounds and get accuracy while you're doing that. So, I mean, it's not as good as like Brilliant, but like for example, Force of Anguish is an interrupt, so just being able to regenerate that is really powerful, especially for boss fights where you only really have one target that you want to keep interrupting. And then you get into the really high level abilities. You got the summons, you get a double summon that duplicates your gear, and that requires a little bit more work than a Priest or a Cipher, but you can easily game that by having the right gear on your summons, and you can just, because it's wounds, you can keep generating more of these summons. And then at the really top level, you get Whispers of the Wind, which, I mean, I feel like every time I played with a single class monk, there's like a before I get this ability and then an after I get this ability phase of the game. Because there's also another item where if you attack someone while you're stealthed, you stun them. And for some reason, Whispers of the Wind counts as being stealthed. And oh my god, like I had Jyoti in one of my parties, single class as a monk, and I didn't really care about her. She was just kind of there. And then I put that on her, give her that ability, and she could literally tank mega bosses at that point because she would just zip around killing things like the Hawane Away, which is a really powerful ooze that keeps splitting. I just kept clicking that button. Eventually, I just created an AI script to just spam that button because her ability generates wounds. She had Dance with Death, which generates wounds, and then she's just constantly killing everything, stunning everything, and then it was just like, okay, the rest of my party is completely unnecessary for this fight. And even outside of that, they have this ability that gives them either more constitution or more intellect based on how many wounds they have. I mean, that's like a loop that works too well. Like you really want to multi-class a monk with a caster if you want a caster, because they have this loop where you have Dance with Death, which generates wound automatically, gives you a greater accuracy bonus that just happens to also work with spells, and then also you get a massive +10 intellect that just nothing else compares to that kind of lift.
And Tenacious as well. Doesn't the pen from Tenacious work on your spells?
Yeah, that too. I forgot about that. That's also a thing. That's also powered by wood, so you can keep uptime on that. I mean, Monk is a blast, don't get me wrong. But I do think it's overtuned, and I would probably edge it over into game breaking. Not like clearly like Cipher and Priest. I would definitely put it like the Monk after them. Because of all these things, I would definitely push it on to that point.
So, all right, just looking at time, we might need to skip through. Is there anything pressing we want to say about Chanter in Overloaded tier? Because Chanter, for me, I do like it for Overloaded tier, but there's a part of me that loves Symmetry, and of the 4 I had in Overloaded, it was the one I was most likely to drop to Bread and Butter. But for you, that's definitely Fighter.
Yeah, I think Chanter is solid Overloaded. I mean, I would actually say that I think that Chanter is the best designed class as opposed to the Monk, because it's just, in terms of the Bard mechanic, it's probably the best realized Bard mechanic they have, and there's just so many ways to play with it. And then the summons are just so good. I don't think there's any way they can fit in a party with other Bread and Butter classes or less and not completely outshine everyone just with the summons that they have.
Yeah, fair enough. And you know what? I will say there is a strong case for Chanter being one of the best design classes ever. The Bard archetype from like Dungeons and Dragons, I always found a little bit lame, but the Chanter just instantly makes it cool. All right, we'll just move on for the sake of time. So
Sure.
In Bread and Butter tier, I had Rogue and Druid.
I mean, I have a soft spot for the Druid, but I can't deny that they are pretty much a bread and butter class. They do a lot of things well, but yeah, compared to like the Overloaded and Game Breaking tier, they don't do anything particularly that well. Same thing with Rogue. I think Rogue is really fun to multi-class with, and I think the Debonair is a really fun class just mechanically. But yeah, I don't think you're going to get much disagreement from me.
My big thing with the Druid, I actually originally had it lower in niche, which is definitely a mistake, I now realize. But I think the reason my instinct was to put it so much lower is that it competes with the Wizard in almost everything it does. And I kind of think the Druid's like the Wizard but balanced. Like if they nerf the Wizard, there might actually be an interesting discussion here. And then the other thing is that Druids were so strong in Pillars 1, like by far my favorite class in Pillars 1, that I kind of had this like reaction of disgust when I made my first Druid and I spirit shifted and I found that I was just doing no damage compared to Pillars 1, but it needed the nerf. It was way overtuned in Pillars 1.
So yeah, the competition with Wizard is interesting. I mean, that kind of makes like the Fury subclass a little bit niche, because I think the main thing that makes the Druid not niche is that it's so good at healing and defensive stuff.
Sure.
And the Fury gets rid of all that for a little bit more offensive advantage. So I mean, again, this is definitely more granular than you want to do, but I think that's a great argument for why Fury is a little bit more niche. And in my play experience, because I played a lot of Druids, I don't touch the Fury that often because you give up such a great part of the kit. And so you become a lot more single-minded than a Wizard. But yeah, it's really the healing that I think that really helps keep it from falling into the niche. But it's kind of like the same thing with Unbending. Like, Druid is really good at healing, but unfortunately, that doesn't help you win. I've definitely gone a little bit overboard early on. Like, I had Garden of Life up and some other heals, and I was immortal. but then I could not kill the enemy party. I just like had no offense, and then the spells wore off and I lost. I'm like, well, that sucked. For similar reasons why I would kind of downrate Unbending. The greatness of the Druid healing is not enough to get it out of bread and butter.
Fair enough, yeah. And it is refreshing to speak to someone who understands the limits of healing. I will say, when you play enough games in this genre, you get tired of the same strategies kind of being dominant over and over. That I have in mind with this is just the idea of basically focusing on offense and then dumping all of your resources as quickly as you can, kind of like on turn one. And really, this loop of play is perpetuated by what I consider kind of stagnant encounter design, where all encounters fall into the same objective of you win whenever you kill the enemy. And most class designs usually have a resource system where you get all of your resources at the beginning of a fight, and then you can spend them however you want. And when you get all your resources at the beginning and you can spend them however you want, the only correct way is to spend them as quickly as possible. Because there's just kind of like a potential energy thing happening where round one, so to speak, is whenever the fight is the most volatile. So I do think if we had games where they explored combats where you could outlast enemies, or where you had slowly building resources, like for example, if the fighter started with 0 discipline and slowly built it over time, kind of like Chanters or Ciphers, then maybe classes like the Druids can really start shining. But yeah, otherwise I agree with you. So niche tier is the last tier. I had 3 classes in here, and they are Barbarian, Paladin, and Ranger. The niche for me of the Barbarian is this kind of like action speed bypassing mob control. Although if you think of there being mob fights and there being boss fights, mob fights are definitely less important. So having a class that specializes in that does kind of make it niche, because that's not the kind of role that you're likely to include in your team. For Paladin, their niche for me was defense stacking for like riposte builds. And for Ranger, I like Rangers quite a bit, and I often have Seers in my party. I think the Seer class is really good. But really their niche is single target accuracy, and that synergizes well with Ciphers and kind of monks and pretty much no one else. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so of these classes that are in the niche, I think the Barbarian and the Ranger kind of suffers from being a little bit one note. I mean, I completely agree where these classes have been ranked. So like the Barbarian in particular. So this is going back to something I mentioned with like how classes have different defenses, and that kind of feeds into this. Barbarians uniquely suffer from having lower than normal deflection. And of course, one of their main abilities, Frenzy, gives them even a bigger debuff to deflection. So unlike the Fighter, where if you mix it with any multiclass, they just automatically become tankier, you can easily mess up a Barbarian multiclass because you just mix it with anything else and you automatically become way more vulnerable to everything else. And if you're not thoughtful about it, you can make the game harder for yourself. And that's kind of unfortunate. And in Pillars of Eternity 1, the trade-off was that you had Carnage, which was really good and almost busted in Pillars of Eternity 1, and it's been nerfed, which is probably fine, but maybe they nerfed it a little bit too far, so you don't get as much of a payoff for most situations as a Barbarian.
Actually,
you do get a payoff.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm dying to hear your opinion on this. Do you think the kind of int and perception stack, kind of midline Barbarian in Pillars 1 was actually the optimal way to build Barbarian? Because I find that it's kind of a superfluous role when you're talking about clearing mobs. Like wizards and druids just do that better. And so if you're building a Barbarian, you actually kind of want to go like a con might Barbarian that stacks retaliation. Like that's actually a niche in Pillars 1 that it had. And that's like the traditional Barbarian. So I felt like all of this gnashing of teeth about building int Barbarians and how that made no sense. I mean, I just disagree on its face. But also it was way overdone, because in my mind that isn't actually the Barbarian's best role. But what do you think?
I was one of the people who gnashed their teeth about the... Well, okay, wait, no. So wait. I was gnashing my teeth when they nerfed Carnage, but I really love that they supported intellect perception builds in Pillars of Eternity 1. Mm-hmm. And in this respect, I think it's kind of like the Blood Mage, where it was really busted at the hardest parts of the game, which were like early on, because you get the intellect scaling right away on Carnage, and then the interrupts from perception really help. Yeah, it kind of like pales in comparison to like high level spells and other high level abilities later on. Barbarian could really carry just a random party if you built like an intellect perception thing.
Yeah, that's true.
So maybe it was for the best that it got nerfed, but I do kind of miss not really being able to do that as well in Deadfire. They did keep a lot of the other traits. That feeds into the whole niche rating because, like, ultimately, when a barbarian becomes very good is with this kind of like narrow choice you have at the end, where you pick up this retaliation talent and or the upgraded shouts, and then you just completely kick everyone's butt. But you have to be single class, and you have to wait basically until the end of your build progression to get these, which is kind of unfortunate. And it's kind of a similar problem with the Ranger, if I just segue there. I don't think this, I mean, I didn't really play a Ranger in Pillars of Eternity 1, so I don't know if this was always the case, but it just happened to have a very specific niche in Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire, with accuracy. But there's only one real way to build this accuracy build, which kind of sucks in terms of build diversity, and kind of limits the interactions you have with other classes. So it can be really, really good at the end. But yeah, I agree ultimately that this is pretty niche because you have to do something very particular to really make it shine. And I think, in particular, the Ranger probably suffered the most out of all the Deadfire classes of just Obsidian needing to iterate on the design to make it better and better and better and more appealing. And I think accuracy just happened to be the niche they eventually settled on, like in patch like 3.0 or something.
Now, there are builds I hear people talk about that utilize driving flight, like with a wizard multi, and you use that special what's it called? The special grimoire that gives you the Nanosense Cobra Fangs for like poison stacking. There's other things like that. And so I'll just say, anyone who's wondering, like, isn't that a niche that the Ranger has? It is very cool, but I think if you test it, you will find that it doesn't really compete at the highest level. If you're really wanting to maximize the Ranger, their true niche is just accuracy stacking. But
playing and being involved with like the Baldur's Gate 3 community and playing that, I've heard a phrase a lot, which I think is accurate for the Ranger, which is like a meme build. Because you can do some really silly things, especially like with driving flight and especially with accuracy stacking, but it's really kind of like one note, and if you play the game more than once, it could get really boring and really stale, and it's not all that great that it's just generally useful everywhere.
So finally, Paladin. Now, whenever I first submitted my list for peer review on the Obsidian forums, obviously I got the most pushback on Fighter, but I'd say the second most pushback I got is putting Paladin in niche. But to me, they're very connected, because one of the reasons I feel like Paladin is niche is that its major thing is tanking. With, barring Death's Door and Unbending, or even Chanter summons, there's just better ways to tank. You don't need a Paladin in the party. So at the end, it just fits in this really weird niche of trying to stack as high deflection as possible, which is a kind of game-breaking thing, because deflection is one of those things where if you stack it high enough, no one can hurt you, and then you also get riposte from it. But it's so niche. What are your thoughts on that?
I honestly, because I skimmed that thread before I made my own contribution. I was honestly surprised you're getting pushback on the Paladin aspect, because I agree with you as Paladins being niche. Yeah, they're very defense-focused, and not in a way that's fun to build around, and not in a way that's very special, I'm sorry to say. Because like the Fighter also has great defenses. Heck, the Wizard, the Trickster Rogue subclass, also has great defenses.
Yeah.
But the Paladin really kind of just drills you into very specific things. You also have to role play correctly to really maximize your defenses, which some people might not like. And the real oddity I find about the Paladin is it comes with offensive stuff, but their baseline offense is so not good that this offensive stuff doesn't really help them be good at anything. It's just kind of like, I don't know. I'm sure there's some like particular multi-class options where you kind of neglect investing in defense, and you let the other classes' offense kind of carry you with some of the offensive stuff the Paladin does. But that's like definition of niche, right? Like that you have to do something very specific, and it's kind of narrow. And similar to Barbarian, it's really weird because at the high levels you can either get an ability that lets you have an aura of flames that periodically casts out. I'm completely blanking on the name. because I play Paladins a lot.
Yeah,
And
I'm
another
blanking too.
ability, which I'm also blanking on, which lets you do tons of healing near you and also just wrecks spirits and vessels near you. Those two abilities
Yes.
are insanely good, but they also come insanely late. And it's like the Barbarian, like, okay, at the end of the game, the Paladin can really shine, but you have to pick one of these abilities and invest in them, and you have to wait for so long. And that's very niche. It's not going to help you on when you're struggling to fight a Drake at like level 6.
All right, I'm glad to hear we agree on that one. Okay, well, that is all of the classes, which means that's it for this discussion. At least what is relevant to this video. Actually, for just under 20 minutes, Thelee and I did continue to discuss other interesting subjects related to Deadfire, but not specifically to this tier list. It was questions like, what do you think about turn-based mode for Deadfire? How does Pillars of Eternity compare to other games in its era? We talked about how it compared to Wrath of the Righteous, Baldur's Gate 3, Divinity Original Sin, etc. We also discussed a very favorite subject of mine, class versus classless systems in RPGs, and other topics. It was very interesting, but ultimately not relevant to this video, so I cut it out. However, I am including it as a separate video for my supporters on Patreon, so if you want to check it out, the link to my Patreon is in the description. As for this video, I think it's gone on long enough. I can't remember the last time I made a 3-hour video, but this subject deserved it, and honestly was a blast to make. I hope it was as fun to watch as it was to make. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.